Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The moving truck's taillights disappeared into the Oregon drizzle, leaving me alone with cardboard boxes and the hollow echo of my footsteps against hardwood floors. The house on Elm Street stretched around me like a mouth waiting to swallow. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and according to the landlord, a steal at $800 a month. In Portland's rental market, deals like this came with catches. I just hadn't expected mine to reveal itself so soon. The first night, I made do with an air mattress in what would become my bedroom upstairs. The previous tenant had left behind more than the standard dust bunnies and forgotten mail. Furniture sat positioned as if someone had simply vanished mid-conversation. A reading chair angled toward an empty corner. Bookshelves stuffed with weathered journals. A desk drawer left partially open. The realtor had mentioned the previous renter's abrupt departure, but offered no details beyond personal circumstances. I'd barely settled into an uneasy sleep when the footsteps began. They started soft, a whispered scuff against carpet downstairs. My first instinct blamed the house settling, pipes cooling, the usual symphony of an unfamiliar building. But the sounds possessed too much rhythm, too much purpose. Each step followed a deliberate pattern. Heel, toe, pause. Heel, toe, pause. Someone pacing the living room below. The digital clock beside my air mattress glowed 11:47 p.m. Too late for neighbors. Too early for early morning joggers. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and crept to the bedroom door, pressing my ear against the cool wood. The footsteps continued, now accompanied by what sounded like furniture being gently shifted, a chair scraping, papers rustling. My descent down the staircase felt like sinking into cold water. Each step amplified under my bare feet, announcing my approach. The living room lay in perfect darkness, streetlight filtering through blinds and weak amber strips. I swept the phone's beam across empty space. No figure, no disturbance, no sign of intrusion. The front door remained locked, deadbolt engaged. Same with the kitchen's back entrance. Yet as I stood there, heart hammering against my ribs, the carpet beneath my feet held evidence I couldn't dismiss. Fresh impressions dotted the high-traffic areas. Footprints appearing and disappearing like invisible feet were still moving across the room. The indentations emerged gradually, as if someone was walking in slow motion, each step materializing seconds after the wait had already passed. I followed the trail with my flashlight beam. The prints led from the living room toward the staircase, growing more defined as they approached the bottom step. Size 11, maybe 12. The same size as my own feet, but positioned differently. A wider gait, longer stride. At the foot of the stairs, the impressions began ascending, one tread at a time. I backed away, phone clutched so tight my knuckles went white. The logical mind scrambled for explanations. Delayed carpet compression from earlier foot traffic, heating vents causing fabric to shift, humidity affecting the pile's memory foam backing. But logic felt thin as tissue paper when confronted with the methodical progression of those footprints climbing toward my bedroom. By morning, the carpet showed no trace of disturbance. Bright daylight streaming through windows revealed ordinary wear patterns and the scattered debris of moving day. I convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Stress from the relocation, unfamiliar sounds, tricks of shadow and fatigue. The second night proved me wrong. This time I'd prepared, leaving lights on throughout the house and my laptop recording audio from the living room. The footsteps began earlier, 10:23 p.m. according to the timestamp, and lasted longer. Not just pacing now, but a complete circuit of the downstairs rooms. Kitchen to dining room to living room to hallway, then back again. A patrol route mapped with precision. I'd positioned myself at the top of the stairs, watching through the banister spindles like a child spying on late-night adult conversations. The carpet impressions appeared in real time now, footprints blooming into existence with each phantom step. Worse, I could hear breathing, measured inhales and exhales that didn't match my own panicked gasping. When I reviewed the laptop recording later, it captured only silence. The discovery of the journals came on my third day in the house, while unpacking books in what I designated as an office. Behind a shelf unit, tucked into a gap where the wall met the baseboards, I found a leather-bound diary wedged so deeply it had to be pried out with a letter opener. The pages, filled with cramped handwriting, belonged to someone named Marcus Chen, presumably my predecessor. The earliest entries read like standard moving day observations, noting which rooms got morning sunlight, complaining about the garbage disposal's grinding noise, cataloging repairs needed for the back fence. But by week 3, Marcus's tone had shifted. The sounds are becoming more frequent. Not just footsteps now, voices, though I can never make out words. They seem to come from beneath the house like people talking in the basement. But there is no basement. I checked the architectural plans at City Hall. This house sits on a concrete slab foundation. My stomach dropped. I'd assumed the house had a basement. Most Portland homes did. I'd never thought to check. Marcus's entries grew increasingly frantic over the following weeks. Found references at the library. This area was part of the original territorial surveys from the 1840s. Native tribes called it the crossing place. Somewhere spirits moved between worlds. Early settlers built here because the land was cheap. They didn't know why it was cheap. The footprints are clearer now. Multiple sets, different sizes. They don't seem hostile, just passing through. Like commuters using a subway platform, but they're using my house as their station. The final entries, dated just 2 weeks before I'd signed the lease, contained information that made my hands shake. It's not random. There's a schedule. They gather between 11:30 and midnight every night. The activity peaks exactly at the witching hour, 12 a.m. That's when the door opens fully. I found building records showing this house was constructed directly over what survivors call a threshold corridor, a thin spot between dimensions. If I don't seal the transition point by midnight tonight, they'll solidify permanently. The upstairs will become their permanent crossing. I have to. The entry cut off mid-sentence. The remaining pages were blank. I spent the afternoon researching online, finding fragments of information that aligned too closely with Marcus's discoveries for comfort. Indigenous folklore did reference crossing places throughout the Pacific Northwest. Early Portland city records mentioned several properties abandoned due to unusual disturbances. The street addresses weren't listed, but the general area descriptions matched my neighborhood. More disturbing. Marcus Chen had indeed lived at this address. Newspaper archives showed a brief missing person report filed by his employer when he'd failed to appear for work. The case remained open, though police had found no evidence of foul play. His belongings had been left behind, lease paid through the end of the month. I was living in the abandoned home of a missing person who documented supernatural phenomena identical to what I'd experienced. That evening, I prepared for midnight with the dedication of someone defusing a bomb. Marcus's journal provided incomplete instructions for sealing the threshold, but I'd gathered supplies based on his hints: salt, sage, silver jewelry, and a bag of industrial-strength construction adhesive I'd picked up from Home Depot. The plan involved creating physical and metaphysical barriers along the living room floor, where the footprint activity seemed most concentrated. By 11:30 p.m., I'd arranged everything in a rough circle around the area where the phantom visitors typically congregated. The house felt different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the air itself had thickened. Static electricity made my arm hair stand on end, and every shadow seemed to pulse with hidden movement. The footsteps began precisely on schedule. But tonight they weren't alone. Voices accompanied the sounds, dozens of them, speaking in languages I couldn't identify. Not threatening conversation, but the casual chatter of people in transit. Occasional laughter echoed from the kitchen. Someone seemed to be moving furniture in the dining room. The sounds of a busy thoroughfare filled my empty house. The footprints appeared faster now, multiple sets overlapping in complex patterns. Size 6s and 13s, narrow feet and wide, some wearing boots while others seemed bare. They crossed the living room in streams, like pedestrians at a busy intersection. And as midnight approached, they began to gain substance. First, just the suggestion of legs. transparent outlines visible only in peripheral vision. Then torsos, faces, entire figures moving through my space with casual disregard for my presence. Men and women, dressed in clothing spanning decades or possibly centuries. Some looked modern, others wore styles I couldn't place. They paid me no attention, focused entirely on their journey from the back of the house toward the staircase. I knelt in the center of my salt circle, hands shaking as I tried to tear open the construction adhesive. The sealant was supposed to create a physical barrier, forcing the entities to find another route. But as transparent feet stepped directly through my carefully arranged salt lines without disturbance, I realized the futility of fighting interdimensional phenomena with Home Depot solutions. The clock on my phone read 11:59. In 60 seconds, according to Marcus's research, the crossing would solidify permanently. The upstairs of my house would become a way station for whatever these travelers represented. I'd be sharing my home with an endless parade of not-quite people passing between realities. The adhesive tube finally opened, sending industrial sealant across my hands and the carpet. I squeezed the entire contents onto the floor in desperate patterns, trying to create some kind of barrier. The chemical smell burned my nostrils, mixing with the sage smoke in a combination that made my eyes water. 11:59:30. The figures grew more solid by the second. I could see details now. A woman's elaborate earrings, a man's weathered boots, the pattern on someone's sweater. They moved with increasing confidence, as if the approaching midnight hour was opening a door that had been only barely cracked. 11:59:45. One of them turned to look at me. Her face held the patient kindness of someone waiting for a delayed train. She gestured toward the staircase, then to her companions, then back to me. The message seemed clear. They needed to pass. This was their route, their schedule, their right of way. I was the intruder here. 11:59:55. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands into the still wet sealant, willing it to work, praying to whatever forces governed these impossible encounters. The voices around me grew louder, more urgent, as if the travelers were hurrying to complete their crossing before the window closed. Midnight struck. The silence was absolute. When I opened my eyes, the living room stood empty. No figures, no footprints, no evidence of the past hour's impossibilities. Even the construction adhesive had vanished, leaving only the faint chemical odor and my salt circle scattered by movements I couldn't recall making. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my air mattress, every nerve ending screaming alert. But the house remained quiet. No footsteps, no voices, no phantom visitors testing their access to the upper floor. Had I succeeded in sealing the threshold? Or had I simply witnessed the completion of whatever cycle Marcus had tried to prevent? 3 weeks have passed since that night. The house stays silent after 11:30 p.m., undisturbed by interdimensional foot traffic. I've found no further journal entries, no additional clues about Marcus's fate. The missing person case remains open, though police show little interest in my theories about supernatural displacement. But I've noticed changes in myself that make me question which version of events actually occurred. Sometimes I catch my reflection behaving independently, continuing to move when I've stopped, gesturing when my hands hang still. In peripheral vision, I occasionally glimpse figures in my house during daylight hours, though they vanish when I turn for a direct look. Most troubling, I've started keeping a journal of my own, documenting strange observations and growing concerns about my situation. But when I review previous entries, I find gaps in my memory, passages written in handwriting that resembles mine but contains details I don't recall experiencing. Yesterday, I discovered something that's shaken my confidence in the entire sequence of events. While cleaning out the desk drawer that came with the house, I found a rental application with my name and signature, dated 3 months before I remember even beginning my housing search. In the margin, someone had written a note in what looks like my handwriting. Successfully sealed, upstairs secure. They use the basement now, but there is no basement in this house. I checked the architectural plans myself, or did I? When I try to recall visiting City Hall, the memory feels thin and insubstantial. like a story someone told me rather than something I experienced. I remember Marcus's journal describing that research, but now I can't find the journal anywhere in the house. I'm writing this account because I need to document what I believe happened, while I still trust my own recollection. But even as I type these words, doubt creeps in around the edges. Did I really experience supernatural visitors, or was I processing stress through elaborate hallucination? Did Marcus Chen exist, or did I create him as a way to externalize my own mounting paranoia about living alone in an unfamiliar space? The footsteps have stopped, but I find myself listening for them anyway, as if their absence disturbs me more than their presence did. Sometimes, in the space between waking and sleep, I wonder if I sealed the threshold successfully, or if I was the one who crossed over that night, leaving some other version of myself to write confused journal entries about dimensional travelers and missing predecessors. The house on Elm Street remains quiet now, but when I look in mirrors, I sometimes see someone looking back who seems surprised to find me there, as if they were expecting someone else entirely. I've started apartment hunting again. $800 was too good a deal. After all, there's always a catch. Story 2. The 43rd floor of the Meridian Tower became my second home somewhere between the third unpaid overtime week and my first glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. Glass walls surrounded my corner workstation like a transparent cage, offering a panoramic view of Chicago's sleeping skyline. During daylight hours, those windows were a blessing. Natural light flooding in, the city sprawling endlessly below. But past midnight, when the office lights dimmed to emergency amber and my monitor's blue glow became the dominant source of illumination, those same windows transformed into mirrors. And mirrors, I've learned, sometimes lie. It started with small discrepancies. A delayed blink. A gesture that lingered a fraction too long after I'd moved on to the next task. I attributed it to exhaustion at first. Weeks of 18-hour days debugging the Morrison account had left me hollow-eyed and twitchy. Sleep deprivation plays tricks on the mind. Everyone knows that. The human brain, deprived of proper rest, begins to misfire, creating false patterns, phantom movements, hallucinations. That's what I told myself during those first weeks of September, when the reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows began to feel less like a mirror image and more like an observer. The building's ventilation system hummed with mechanical consistency, punctuated by the occasional creak of settling steel and concrete. 43 floors below, late-night traffic created a distant urban lullaby. But between those familiar sounds, in the spaces where silence should have lived, I began to notice something else. The soft tap of fingertips against glass. Not from my side. I would pause mid-keystroke, fingers hovering over my keyboard, listening. The tapping would stop. I'd return to work, and moments later, there it was again, deliberate, patient, coming from somewhere behind the reflection that watched me with my own eyes. The first time I turned to confront it directly, spinning my chair to face the window, I saw only the Chicago skyline at 3 a.m. Scattered office lights in distant buildings, street lamps creating geometric patterns on empty streets, the faint glow of Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon. No reflection at all. But when I turned back to my monitor, there it was in the peripheral darkness of the screen's black border. My face, wearing an expression I wasn't making. October brought shorter days and longer nights, extending my isolation in the glass tower. The Morrison account had evolved into something larger, more demanding, requiring constant attention and revision. I found myself arriving earlier and leaving later, until the distinction between day and night blurred into a continuous cycle of fluorescent lighting and caffeine. That's when the reflection began to move independently. I noticed it first during a video conference with the Tokyo office. My camera was off, but I could see myself in the window's reflection as I spoke. The mirrored figure nodded when I nodded, gestured when I gestured, but always a beat behind, as if receiving delayed instructions. During a particularly animated explanation about server optimization, I watched my reflection continue moving its mouth long after I'd stopped speaking. The realization struck me like cold water. It was finishing my sentence. I ended the call abruptly, claiming technical difficulties. In the sudden silence that followed, I found myself staring at the window, searching for signs of what I'd witnessed. The reflection stared back, perfectly synchronized now, mimicking every breath, every micro-expression. But behind my reflected eyes, I sensed something that hadn't been there before. A curious intelligence, studying me as intently as I studied it. Sleep became elusive. Even when I managed to leave the office before dawn, I would lie in my apartment replaying the night's events, questioning each detail. Was I losing my mind? Stress-induced psychosis seemed plausible, almost preferable to the alternative. I researched the symptoms: paranoid delusions, visual hallucinations, dissociative episodes. The medical literature provided comfort in its clinical certainty. But medical literature couldn't explain the security footage. I discovered the building's internal camera system while searching for network documentation in the shared server directory. 43 floors of surveillance, archived in neat digital folders. My workstation appeared in camera 43C, a wide-angle view capturing my desk and the windows beyond. What I saw in those recordings defied explanation. While I worked, focused on my monitor, the cameras showed something else entirely. In the window's reflection, barely visible in the low-light recording, another figure moved with purposeful independence. It would stand when I sat, pace when I remained still, and turn to examine different parts of the office while I remained fixed on my screen. More disturbing were the moments when it seemed to notice the camera itself. The reflected figure would look directly at the lens, meeting the mechanical eye with an expression of calculated awareness that my actual face never wore. I started arriving earlier, staying later, driven by an obsession to understand what was happening. The building's daytime energy, hundreds of employees, ringing phones, humming conversations, provided a kind of protective camouflage. But as evening approached and the floors emptied, I could feel the change beginning. The first overtly hostile act occurred on a Tuesday night in late October. I had stepped away from my desk to retrieve printouts from the break room printer, leaving my workstation illuminated in the darkened office. When I returned, coffee in hand, my keyboard was wet. Not damp from condensation or a spilled drink, but soaking wet, as if someone had poured an entire cup of water directly onto the keys. The nearest water source was the break room I'd just left. My coffee cup remained full, and there were no other beverages at my desk. I checked the ceiling for leaks, examined the air conditioning vents for condensation. Nothing. The moisture seemed to have appeared from nowhere, leaving my expensive mechanical keyboard completely unusable. But in the window's reflection, I could see water droplets on the inside surface of the glass, as if someone on the other side had pressed their face against it, breathing heavily, fogging the mirror with their exhalations. The incidents escalated. Files would disappear from my computer, only to reappear in different locations with subtle modifications. A word changed here, a number altered there. My desk lamp would flicker in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. The office printer, 3 departments away, would activate in the middle of the night, churning out blank pages that formed neat stacks by morning. Most unsettling was the sound of footsteps. They followed a path from my workstation to the break room and back, audible only when I remained perfectly still. The steps had weight to them, the distinct pattern of dress shoes on industrial carpeting. But when I checked the security cameras, they showed only empty corridors, my lone figure hunched over the glowing monitor. In the reflection, however, another story played out. The mirrored version of myself would stand, straighten its tie, and walk purposefully through the office space, examining files, testing door handles, studying the building's layout with methodical precision. It was learning. November brought the first direct confrontation. I had been working on a particularly complex algorithm when movement in my peripheral vision made me look up. In the window's reflection, my doppelganger was standing directly behind my chair, leaning forward to read over my shoulder. But when I spun around, nothing was there except empty office space and the distant glow of emergency lighting. When I turned back to my monitor, it was waiting for me in the reflection, close enough that I could see individual eyelashes, the slight stubble on its chin, the way it breathed through slightly parted lips. It raised one hand and pressed it against the glass from the inside. leaving no mark on the surface but creating a clear handprint in the reflected world. Then it mouthed a single word: soon. The revelation that my reflection could cross over came gradually, then all at once. I began noticing small differences in the office when I arrived each morning. A chair positioned differently, elevator buttons that showed recent use despite the building's empty overnight hours. The security guard mentioned seeing lights moving through the 43rd floor long after I'd supposedly left. But I hadn't left. I'd been there all night, working, while something else moved through the building wearing my face. The technology department received complaints about network intrusions traced to my workstation, occurring during hours when I had clear alibis. The cleaning crew reported finding my office rearranged, with equipment moved and personal items relocated. HR scheduled a wellness check, concerned about my reported behavior inconsistencies. I realized with growing horror that my reflection wasn't just observing anymore, it was practicing. Learning to be me, understanding my routines, my mannerisms, my digital fingerprints. It was preparing for something larger. The crossing happened on a Thursday night in December. I had been working late, as usual, when the power flickered and the building's lights dimmed to emergency backup. In the sudden change of illumination, I caught sight of my reflection behaving strangely. Instead of mirroring my movements, it had turned away from me entirely, examining something beyond the window frame that I couldn't see. Then, with movements that seemed to require tremendous effort, it began to turn back toward me. But this time, it wasn't my reflection anymore. It was someone else entirely. Someone wearing my face but possessing entirely different expressions, different posture, different intent. As I watched in paralyzed fascination, the figure in the glass pressed both hands against the window surface from the inside. The glass began to ripple like water, distorting the reflection until it seemed less like a mirror image and more like a portal. And then it stepped through. The sensation was indescribable, feeling yourself exit your own body while remaining perfectly aware of the transition. I watched from my chair as another version of myself emerged from the window, shaking glass dust from its shoulders like snow. It wore my clothes, possessed my face, moved with my gait, but its eyes held an intelligence that felt foreign, calculating, predatory. It looked at me with undisguised satisfaction and walked directly to my workstation. "Thank you for the practice," it said, settling into my chair with disturbing familiarity. "I think I'm ready now." Panic drove me to my feet, but I discovered something terrifying. I cast no reflection in the windows anymore. In the glass surfaces that surrounded the office, I was invisible, incorporeal, a ghost in my own workspace. Meanwhile, my replacement began typing with my fingers, accessing my files with my passwords, becoming me with methodical precision. I tried to speak, to scream, to assert my reality, but no sound emerged. I reached for my reflection, desperate to reclaim my place, but my hands passed through the glass like smoke. The thing wearing my face looked up from the monitor and smiled. "Don't worry," it said. "I'll take good care of your life, your colleagues, your apartment, your savings account. I'll be a better you than you ever were." But then I remembered something crucial: the monitors. In my research, I had discovered that certain types of light could create barriers, could define boundaries between reflected and real. The cold blue glow of LCD screens, the specific frequency of LED backlighting, these created a kind of electromagnetic field that seemed to affect whatever lived in the mirror world. Moving with desperate purpose, I began activating every monitor in the office. Computer screens flickered to life, creating pools of blue-white radiance that carved sharp shadows through the space. The thing at my desk looked up with concern as the lighting changed, its confident expression faltering. "What are you doing?" it demanded, but its voice had lost some of its certainty. I continued my work, switching on every available display, adjusting brightness settings to maximum, surrounding the office with protective illumination. The reflected world, so dominant in the amber emergency lighting, began to fade as LCD screens created a new visual hierarchy. And slowly, gradually, I began to cast a reflection again. The battle for my identity became a literal tug-of-war between realities. As the monitor glow intensified, I felt myself becoming more solid, more real, while my doppelganger seemed to lose definition. It fought back, frantically typing commands to shut down the displays, but I had the advantage of knowing the building's systems better than anyone. Emergency lighting, security monitors, digital displays throughout the floor. I activated everything that could produce the specific blue spectrum that seemed to weaken whatever force allowed the crossing. The office became a constellation of electronic light, each screen a small sun pushing back the darkness where reflections could live independently. With a sound like breaking glass played in reverse, my double began to dissolve at the edges, its carefully stolen solidity unwinding like smoke. It looked at me with expressions that cycled rapidly between rage, fear, and something that might have been respect. "This isn't over," it whispered as it faded. "I know where you live now. I know who you are." But as dawn began to lighten the eastern windows and the building's normal lighting systems came online, the thing that had tried to steal my life retreated back into the glass world where it belonged. I waited until full daylight before turning off the monitors, before allowing normal reflections to return. When I finally looked into the windows, I saw only myself, tired, shaken, but unquestionably real. The medical leave was easy to arrange. Exhaustion, stress, overwork. The company had seen it before and would see it again. I spent 6 weeks in a cabin in Wisconsin, far from windows, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky. But when I returned to work, assigned to a different floor with different windows, I sometimes caught myself checking my reflection more carefully than before, looking for signs of independence, for expressions that weren't quite mine, for evidence that something was still watching from the other side of the glass. Because late at night, when the city lights create that perfect mirror surface, I still feel observed. And sometimes, just sometimes, I notice my reflection blink a fraction of a second after I do. The doctors say it's post-traumatic stress, a lingering effect of sleep deprivation and overwork. The human mind, they explain, can create incredibly convincing false realities when pushed beyond its limits. But they've never worked the night shift in a glass tower in Chicago. They've never seen their own face watching them with alien intelligence, learning their habits, practicing their life. And they've never had to wonder, as I do every single day, whether the person looking back at them from the mirror is really them at all. Because the truth is, I'm no longer certain which side of the glass I'm actually on. Story 3. The call came on a Tuesday evening, when the October wind was already whispering threats through the bare branches outside my office. 23 years selling real estate in Vermont, and I thought I'd seen every type of buyer imaginable. But the voice on the other end of the line carried something different, a quality that made me unconsciously lean back in my chair. He wanted to see the Morrison place, the Victorian mansion that had been rotting on Deer Creek Road for the better part of a decade, its asking price dropping every 6 months like a stone thrown into deep water. Most folks around here knew better than to even drive past it after dark, though they couldn't quite articulate why. Local superstition, I'd always told myself. Small town nonsense that kept a perfectly good property off the market. The man, he'd given his name as Mr. Thorne, insisted on an evening showing. 7 o'clock sharp, he'd specified, just as the sun was setting behind the Green Mountains. I'd tried to suggest an earlier time, citing the poor lighting and the house's temperamental electrical system, but he'd been adamant. Something about his schedule, he'd said, though his tone suggested the matter wasn't open for discussion. Deer Creek Road stretched before me like a dark ribbon when I arrived 5 minutes early, my headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. The Morrison house loomed at the end of a quarter-mile gravel drive, its Gothic revival architecture creating a silhouette that seemed to absorb, rather than reflect the dying light. 3 stories of weathered, clapboard siding rose to meet a slate roof punctuated by dormers that stared down like hooded eyes. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on its posts, and paint peeled from the ornate gingerbread trim in long, pale strips. I'd been inside exactly twice before, once when old Morrison had died, and the estate needed assessment, and again 6 months later when a young couple from Boston had expressed interest. The Boston couple had lasted exactly 17 minutes before excusing themselves with mumbled apologies about poor fit for their needs. I'd attributed their hasty departure to the house's obvious maintenance issues and the musty smell that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Tonight felt different. As I sat in my car, engine ticking as it cooled, I found myself studying the windows of the house with unusual intensity. Each one was dark, naturally, but something about their emptiness seemed deliberate. Not the casual darkness of an unoccupied building, but the purposeful blackness of spaces that had been prepared for concealment. Headlights appeared in my rearview mirror at exactly 7 o'clock. The approaching car moved slowly, almost ceremoniously, its high beams creating twin tunnels of light through the mist that had begun to rise from the creek. When it stopped beside my vehicle, I caught my first glimpse of Mr. Thorne through his driver's side window. He was younger than his voice had suggested, perhaps 40, with sharp features and prematurely gray hair combed back from a high forehead. What struck me immediately, however, were the dark sunglasses he wore despite the rapidly fading light. When he stepped out of his car, a black sedan that looked expensive but somehow anonymous, his movements possessed an odd, measured quality, as though each gesture had been carefully calculated. We exchanged pleasantries as I retrieved the house keys from my briefcase, though I noticed he kept his responses brief and somehow managed to avoid answering my standard questions about his family situation or financing. His handshake, when offered, felt surprisingly cold for such a mild evening. The front door of the Morrison house opened with the prolonged creak that only old hinges can produce. The smell hit me immediately. Not the expected mustiness of a closed-up house, but something deeper and more complex. It carried notes of old wood and tarnished metal, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me uncomfortably of flowers left too long in stagnant water. I flicked the wall switch, and the foyer chandelier responded with a weak, amber glow that seemed to struggle against the darkness. The wide central hallway stretched before us, its hardwood floors partially covered by a runner that had once been burgundy, but now appeared nearly black in the dim light. Doorways opened to the left and right, leading to the formal parlor and dining room respectively. Mr. Thorne moved past me into the hallway, his footsteps making no sound on the wooden floors. I attributed this to the thick Persian rugs scattered throughout the house, though later I would realize I hadn't actually seen him step on any of them. The parlor drew his immediate attention. It was a spacious room with tall windows facing the front yard, furnished with pieces that Morrison's estate had left behind: a horsehair sofa, several wingback chairs, and an ornate mantelpiece dominated by an enormous mirror. The mirror, I noticed, had been covered with a heavy cloth that looked like black velvet. "Interesting choice," I commented, gesturing toward the covered glass. The previous owner must have had strong feelings about mirrors. Mr. Thorne paused before the covered mirror, tilting his head slightly. "Perhaps he understood their true purpose," he said quietly, then moved on before I could ask what he meant. The dining room presented a similar scene. Here, a massive mahogany table occupied the center of the space, surrounded by 8 high-backed chairs. Above it hung another chandelier, and on the far wall, another mirror, this one also shrouded in dark fabric. I was beginning to notice a pattern that I hadn't observed during my previous visits. We moved through the house systematically, Mr. Thorne examining each room with the focused attention of someone conducting an inspection, rather than a casual viewing. The kitchen, with its vintage fixtures and stone hearth, seemed to hold particular interest for him. He spent several minutes running his fingers along the surface of the butcher block island, though he declined my offer to demonstrate the antique stove. It was on the second floor that things began to feel truly unsettling. The wide staircase creaked under our weight, at least under mine, as we climbed to the bedroom level. The hallway here was narrower than the one below, with doors leading to 6 different rooms. What struck me as odd was that several of these doors appeared to be identical duplicates, down to the brass hardware and the specific pattern of wood grain. "The master bedroom is at the end of the hall," I explained, consulting the property notes I'd brought along. But when we reached what should have been the master bedroom, we found ourselves in a room that looked exactly like the parlor downstairs. Same furniture arrangement, Same wallpaper, same covered mirror dominating the far wall. I stared at the space, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The floor plan I'd studied showed this room as the master bedroom, complete with an ensuite bathroom and walk-in closet. Instead, we stood in what appeared to be an exact replica of the ground floor parlor, even down to the pattern of dust motes floating in the weak light from the overhead fixture. "How curious," Mr. Thorne murmured, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly surprised by this architectural impossibility. I mumbled something about checking my notes, but when I looked at the property diagram again, it clearly showed a parlor on the second floor. Had I misremembered the layout? I'd shown this house before, hadn't I? Suddenly I wasn't entirely certain. We continued down the hallway, opening doors that should have led to additional bedrooms, but instead revealed more duplicate rooms. Another dining room with its shrouded mirror, a second kitchen identical to the one below, even a replica of the foyer complete with the same burgundy runner and weak chandelier. The sensation of walking through these duplicated spaces began to affect me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. It was as though the house were folding in on itself, creating a maze of repeated experiences that challenged my basic understanding of physical space. My sense of direction, usually reliable, started to falter. When I tried to remember which staircase we'd used to reach this floor, I found the memory strangely elusive. Mr. Thorne moved through these impossible rooms with complete composure, occasionally pausing to examine a piece of furniture or run his hand along a wall. I began to watch him more carefully, and that's when I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. We were standing in one of the duplicate parlors when the weak overhead light flickered and steadied. In that brief moment of illumination, I caught sight of our reflection in a mirror that had somehow become uncovered. The glass showed my own image clearly: rumpled suit, nervous expression, slightly graying hair catching the amber light. But where Mr. Thorne should have been standing beside me, there was only empty space. I turned to look at him directly, confirming he was indeed there, solid and present in his dark coat and sunglasses. When I looked back at the mirror, it showed only my solitary reflection, as though I were alone in the room. My hands began to shake. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. A trick of the light, perhaps, or some flaw in the old mirror's silvering. But as we continued through the house, I began checking other reflective surfaces whenever possible. The pattern remained consistent. Every mirror, every window, every polished surface showed my reflection and nothing else. By the time we reached the third floor, my nerves were stretched to their breaking point. The top level of the house consisted of what should have been servants' quarters and storage spaces. Instead, we found more duplicated rooms, each one a perfect copy of spaces from the floors below. The air up here felt thicker somehow, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Mr. Thorne had grown more animated as we climbed higher in the house. His movements, while still measured, now carried an undercurrent of excitement that he was clearly struggling to contain. When he spoke, his voice had taken on a different quality. Not quite his own anymore, but something older and more complex. "This house," he said as we stood in yet another replica parlor, "has unique properties. The previous owner understood the importance of creating anchor points, physical spaces that can hold substantial energy." I wanted to ask what he meant, but found myself reluctant to speak. The sound of my own voice in these duplicated rooms had begun to seem foreign and intrusive. We descended back to the main floor through a staircase that I was certain hadn't been there when we'd climbed up. The layout of the house seemed to shift around us, corridors extending where I remembered walls, doorways appearing where none had existed before. I tried to maintain my professional composure, but the pretense was wearing thin. In the main foyer, Mr. Thorne finally removed his sunglasses. His eyes, when revealed, were a pale blue that seemed almost colorless in the dim light. They held an intelligence that felt ancient and patient, as though they had seen centuries pass while remaining fundamentally unchanged. "The house will suit my needs perfectly," he announced. "I'd like to make an immediate offer." I should have been pleased. The Morrison place had been a persistent problem, tying up marketing resources and generating nothing but complications. A quick sale would solve multiple problems and earn me a substantial commission. Instead, I felt a growing certainty that completing this transaction would be a mistake. Not just for professional reasons, but for reasons I couldn't begin to articulate. Perhaps you'd like to see the property in daylight, I suggested weakly. The basement and outbuildings, the garden areas. He shook his head. What I need to see, I've seen. The house offers the necessary accommodations. The mirror work is particularly comprehensive. As he spoke, I realized that every covered mirror we'd encountered had been intentionally prepared for concealment. Someone, presumably Morrison before his death, had gone through the house systematically, shrouding every reflective surface with dark cloth. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Morrison had known something about mirrors and reflections that I was only beginning to understand. The offer Mr. Thorne presented was generous, 20% above asking price, cash sale, no inspections required. Under normal circumstances, I would have been calling Morrison's heirs before we left the property. Instead, I found myself stalling, inventing concerns about title searches and disclosure requirements. We stood in the foyer as I fumbled through my briefcase, pretending to look for forms I had no intention of producing. The house around us seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though it were aware of the transaction being discussed and eager for its completion. "There's something you should know," I said finally, though I wasn't sure what I intended to reveal. Mr. Thorne waited, his pale eyes fixed on my face with uncomfortable intensity. "The house has a history," I continued. "Morrison lived here for 40 years, but he died alone. Nobody found him for weeks, and there were incidents before that. Previous owners who left suddenly, always after short stays." "Incidents," he repeated, though his tone suggested the word amused rather than concerned him. "Strange reports, people seeing movement in windows when the house was empty, sounds coming from rooms that should have been vacant, and the mirrors." I gestured helplessly at the covered glass in the foyer. "Morrison covered them all before he died. The estate never said why." Mr. Thorne smiled for the first time since we'd met. The expression transformed his face completely, revealing something that made me take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Morrison was a prudent man," he said. "He understood that some transitions require careful preparation. The mirrors aren't covered to hide something from getting out, Mr. Fletcher. They're covered to prevent something from getting in." The way he said my name made me realize I'd never told him what it was. I found myself backing toward the front door, my professional training forgotten in favor of a more primitive instinct for self-preservation. Mr. Thorne made no move to follow me, but his presence seemed to fill the foyer anyway, expanding to occupy space that physics insisted he couldn't possibly reach. "The offer will remain open until the next equinox," he said as I fumbled with the door handle. "You'll find the paperwork has already been prepared." I turned to ask what he meant, but the foyer was empty. The only evidence of Mr. Thorne's presence was a business card lying on the hall table. Expensive stock, embossed lettering, no address or phone number. Just a name and a single line: Specialized Property Acquisitions. I left the Morrison house that night with more questions than I'd arrived with. The drive back to town passed in a blur of confused thoughts and failed attempts to rationalize what I'd experienced. By the time I reached my office, I'd almost convinced myself that stress and imagination had created elaborate explanations for simple phenomena. Almost. The next morning brought a call from Morrison's nephew in California. The estate had received an offer on the house, a generous cash offer accompanied by all necessary documentation. The buyer had requested immediate closing, waiving all standard contingencies. Did I know anything about a Mr. Thorne? I told him I'd shown the property to a prospective buyer, but recommended he consider the offer carefully. Something about my tone must have conveyed more than my words, because he asked if there were problems with the buyer's credentials. How could I explain that the problem wasn't with the buyer's credentials, but with his very existence? That I'd spent 2 hours walking through a house that defied physical laws with a man who cast no reflection? That I'd watched him examine rooms that shouldn't have existed, selecting a property based on criteria that had nothing to do with normal human habitation? The nephew interpreted my hesitation as standard realtor caution and assured me he'd handle the due diligence personally. The sale closed 3 weeks later. I processed the paperwork mechanically, collected my commission, and tried to put the entire experience behind me. But certain details refused to fade. The way Mr. Thorne had moved through the house with perfect familiarity, as though he'd walked those halls before. His comment about the equinox, which was still months away. Most troubling of all, his final words about mirrors being covered to prevent something from getting in. I've driven past the Morrison place twice since the sale closed. The first time in broad daylight, it looked like any other old house, shabby but unremarkable, with no signs of occupancy. The second time, just after sunset, I noticed that lights were on in several windows. More unsettling, the upstairs windows seemed to show movement, shadows passing back and forth with the regular, purposeful rhythm of someone pacing. The mirrors, I assume, have been uncovered by now. Sometimes, late at night in my office, I find myself researching property records and local history, trying to understand the pattern I'm beginning to recognize. The Morrison house isn't unique. There are others scattered across New England. Old properties that change hands regularly, always sold to buyers who pay cash and never stay long. Houses with architectural anomalies that don't appear on original blueprints. Properties where the previous owners made strange modifications before their deaths. And I'm beginning to suspect that Mr. Thorne has a longer history in real estate than his business card suggests. The equinox is approaching. I've been thinking about that deadline he mentioned, wondering what significance it holds for someone who requires anchor points and specialized mirror work. Wondering, too, about what happens when the current arrangement expires and he needs to find new accommodations. My phone has been ringing more often lately. Calls from potential buyers interested in specific types of properties. Old houses, remote locations, particular architectural features. Buyers who insist on evening showings and seem unconcerned with standard inspection protocols. I've started declining these appointments, claiming scheduling conflicts or recommending other agents. But the calls keep coming, and the voices on the other end are becoming familiar in ways that make my hands shake when I reach for the receiver. Last week, I covered the mirror in my office bathroom. I told myself it was because the glass had developed spots that distorted reflections, but that wasn't entirely true. The real reason was that I'd started noticing things in that mirror, shadows that didn't correspond to anything in the room, movements that occurred when I was standing perfectly still. I'm beginning to understand why Morrison covered his mirrors, and why the action might have been an act of self-preservation rather than eccentricity. Some things, once invited in, prove reluctant to leave. And some houses serve purposes that have nothing to do with providing shelter for the living. The phone is ringing again as I write this. I can see the caller ID from where I sit. Unknown number, but I know who it is, just as I know what he'll want when I answer. Another house, another evening showing, another step in a process that began long before I understood what I was participating in. I'm going to let it ring, for now. But the equinox is still coming, and when it arrives, I suspect my choices will become more limited. Mr. Thorne strikes me as someone who completes his transactions one way or another, regardless of the cooperation of all parties involved. The mirror in my office bathroom remains covered. I've been avoiding my reflection in other surfaces as well, just in case, because I'm starting to suspect that the real danger isn't what you might see in a mirror. It's what might see you first. Story 4. The first thing I noticed about the Lake Tahoe chalet wasn't the breathtaking view of the crystalline water or the towering pines that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. It was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet you'd expect in the mountains, but something heavier, a pressing absence of sound that made my ears ring and my chest feel tight. Marcus found the place on some obscure rental site, boasting about scoring a deal that seemed too good to be true. Now, standing in the shadow of the 3-story wooden structure with its dark windows staring down like hollow eyes, I understood why the price had been so reasonable. The place radiated an aura of neglect that no amount of fresh paint could disguise. The 6 of us, Marcus, Ben, Tyler, Jake, Devin, and myself, had planned this weekend as a reunion of sorts, a chance to escape the suffocating routine of our daily lives. We'd been friends since college, and these annual trips had become sacred, a tradition that kept us tethered to who we used to be before mortgages and marriages, and the grinding weight of adult responsibility. Inside, the chalet revealed itself to be larger than it appeared from the exterior. Dark wood paneling absorbed what little light filtered through the windows, and every footstep echoed with a hollow resonance that suggested vast, empty spaces hidden within the walls. The furniture was dated but well maintained, everything covered in a thin layer of dust that spoke of recent abandonment. It was Devon who discovered the narrow staircase leading to the attic, hidden behind a door we'd initially mistaken for a closet. The wooden steps groaned under our weight as we climbed, flashlight beams dancing across cobwebs and casting our shadows in strange, distorted shapes on the slanted walls. The attic stretched the full length of the building, filled with the detritus of decades. Cardboard boxes, moth-eaten furniture, and the musty smell of time itself. But it was the object in the center of the space that drew our attention like a magnet. A circular wooden board, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, sat on a makeshift table constructed from sawhorses and plywood. The surface had been meticulously carved with an intricate pattern of lines, symbols, and coordinates. At first glance, it resembled an antique navigation instrument, but as I leaned closer, the complexity became apparent. These weren't terrestrial coordinates, they were celestial. Star charts, constellation markers, and mathematical notations covered every inch of the dark wood. Marcus ran his fingers along the carved lines, and I could have sworn I felt a subtle vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet. The sensation was so faint I dismissed it as imagination, but something cold crawled up my spine nonetheless. Ben discovered the telescope in a corner, a substantial piece of equipment that seemed far too valuable to abandon in an attic. It was an older model, but clearly professional grade, the kind of instrument that belonged in an observatory rather than a vacation rental. When we hauled it downstairs and set it up on the deck facing the lake, the weight of its construction surprised me. This wasn't a hobbyist's toy. Night fell with unusual swiftness, as if the mountains were swallowing the sun before its time. The darkness that settled over Lake Tahoe was profound, unmarred by the light pollution we were accustomed to in the city. Stars emerged with startling clarity, and the Milky Way unfurled across the sky like spilled flour. We'd brought the carved board down with us, drawn by its mysterious precision and the strange compulsion to understand its purpose. The coordinates were clearly marked, and Tyler, who'd taken astronomy courses in college, began the process of aligning the telescope with the first set of markings. The moment the telescope locked onto the designated celestial position, I felt it, a subtle shift in the world around us. The chalet creaked, not with the normal settling sounds of an old building, but with something more deliberate. The entire structure seemed to sway slightly, as if a gentle hand had pushed against its foundation. My friends attributed the sensation to fatigue or alcohol, laughing off my concerns with the easy dismissal of people who haven't yet learned to trust their instincts. But I felt it again when Tyler adjusted the telescope to the second set of coordinates. This time, the movement was more pronounced, accompanied by a deep groaning sound that seemed to emanate from the building's bones. By the third alignment, we were all feeling it. The chalet had definitely shifted, the deck tilting at an angle that made standing uncomfortable. Items began sliding across surfaces, and the lake view through the telescope's eyepiece showed a horizon that no longer aligned with my memory. Devon suggested we stop, his voice carrying the first note of genuine concern I'd heard all evening. But Marcus was fascinated, convinced we'd stumbled onto some kind of elaborate prank or hidden mechanism designed to entertain guests. He urged Tyler to continue, and against my growing sense of unease, we proceeded to the fourth coordinate set. The shift this time was unmistakable. The entire chalet lurched several inches to the left, accompanied by the sound of something fundamental breaking, not wood or metal, but something deeper, more essential. Through the windows, I could see the neighboring trees at impossible angles, their tops now level with what should have been our second-story view. That's when I noticed the stars. They weren't where they should have been. Constellations I'd known since childhood had rotated, shifted, or disappeared entirely. The Big Dipper hung inverted in the eastern sky, and Orion's belt formed a perfect vertical line rather than its familiar slant. Either the entire universe had rearranged itself, or we were no longer observing it from the same position. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. The chalet wasn't just shifting, it was rising. Each alignment of the telescope with the carved coordinates was somehow lifting the entire structure away from its foundation, away from the Earth itself, as if we were being drawn upward into the cosmic void between the stars. My friends noticed the impossible star positions at roughly the same time I did. The easy laughter died, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the constant groaning of the building around us. When I suggested we pack up the telescope and retreat inside, no one argued. But inside offered no comfort. The windows now showed only star-filled darkness in every direction, confirming my worst fear. We were no longer connected to solid ground. The chalet hung suspended in space, held aloft by forces I couldn't begin to comprehend, slowly ascending towards some unimaginable destination. Tyler examined the carved board with new urgency, his fingers tracing the remaining coordinate sets we hadn't yet aligned. There were dozens more, each presumably corresponding to another step in our journey away from Earth. The mathematical precision of the carving suggested this wasn't random. Someone had planned this, calculated every movement, every celestial waypoint on our path into the void. The temperature began dropping rapidly. Frost formed on the inside of the windows, and our breath misted in the increasingly thin air. The building's ascent was accelerating, and I could feel the pressure change in my ears, the same sensation experienced during rapid altitude gain in an aircraft. That's when Ben made the connection that saved us. Studying the board's intricate pattern, he realized the coordinates weren't just navigational markers. They formed a complete circuit. The final carving, barely visible along the board's outer edge, brought the sequence full circle back to its starting point. If we could reverse the process, align the telescope with the coordinates in backward order, we might be able to retrace our path. The logic was desperate but undeniable. We had perhaps 20 minutes before the remaining alignments would be automatically triggered. I could see the board's surface beginning to glow with a faint phosphorescence, each untriggered coordinate pulsing with increasing frequency. Working in the growing cold and diminishing air, we repositioned the telescope and began the reverse sequence. The first backward alignment produced an immediate response. The chalet shuddered and dropped several feet, accompanied by a sound like reality tearing at its seams. Each subsequent coordinate brought us closer to Earth, but the process was becoming increasingly unstable. The building spun slowly as it descended, and through the windows I caught glimpses of impossible geometries, spaces that folded in on themselves, distances that contracted and expanded without reason. By the time we reached the final coordinate, I was no longer certain what was real. The boundaries between perception and imagination had blurred beyond recognition. Were we actually suspended in space? Or had I suffered some kind of psychological break triggered by the isolation and strange atmosphere of the place? The last alignment slammed us back to Earth with tremendous force. The chalet settled onto its foundation with a crash that rattled every window and sent us sprawling across the floor. When we picked ourselves up and looked outside, the familiar landscape of Lake Tahoe stretched before us, bathed in normal starlight under a properly arranged sky. We packed hastily and left that morning, none of us speaking about what had happened. In the daylight, the event seemed impossible, the product of group hysteria or mass hallucination triggered by altitude, alcohol, and the power of suggestion. But I kept the carved board. It sits in my garage now, wrapped in canvas and pushed into the farthest corner where I can pretend it doesn't exist. Sometimes on clear nights when the stars shine particularly bright, I can hear it calling, a low vibration that seems to resonate in my bones, promising answers to questions I'm afraid to ask. The others have moved on, convinced that what we experienced was some elaborate trick or shared delusion. They've returned to their normal lives, their routines, their comfortable certainties about the nature of reality. I envy them, because late at night, when sleep eludes me, and I stand at my window staring up at the familiar constellations, I can still feel it. That subtle wrongness in the way the stars are arranged, as if the universe itself has been shifted slightly off its proper axis. And I wonder if what we experienced that night at Lake Tahoe wasn't an escape from reality, but a glimpse of the truth that lies hidden behind the comfortable illusions we mistake for the real world. The board waits in my garage, patient and eternal, its coordinates still carved with mathematical precision into the dark wood. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I find myself walking toward the garage door, drawn by forces I can't name toward revelations I'm not sure I want to understand. The only thing that stops me is the knowledge that this time, I might not find my way back. Story 5. The fluorescent lights in the office building had been flickering all day, casting intermittent shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I should have taken it as a warning. 5:30 came and went like any other Tuesday. I gathered my things, nodded to the security guard whose name I'd never learned, and stepped into the elevator that groaned its familiar protest. The descent felt longer than usual, each floor marker blinking past with mechanical indifference. When the doors finally opened, the lobby felt different. The marble floors somehow duller, the air thicker, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. Outside, the city hummed with its usual evening symphony. Car horns, distant sirens, the shuffle of countless feet against concrete. I walked the same route I'd taken for 3 years, past the coffee shop where the barista always smiled but never remembered my order, past the newsstand where the headlines seemed to blur together into meaningless noise. The autumn air carried that peculiar urban scent of exhaust and fallen leaves, tinged with something else I couldn't quite identify, something metallic, like the taste of copper pennies left too long in a pocket. I was fishing for my keys when I heard the van's engine. It wasn't the sound that caught my attention first, but the silence that preceded it. The city's background noise had simply stopped, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. In that vacuum of sound, the van's low rumble emerged like a predator's growl. I turned to see a gray vehicle idling at the curb, its windows tinted so dark they reflected nothing, not even the streetlights that had just flickered on. The passenger door swung open. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the sidewalk. The van's interior was darker than the windows had suggested. Not just dark, but absolutely void, as if light itself refused to cross the threshold. I could make out the silhouette of a driver, but the details of their face remained stubbornly obscured, like trying to focus on something at the edge of peripheral vision. A voice emerged from that darkness, though I couldn't tell if it came from the driver or the van itself. The words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly in my skull with the uncomfortable intimacy of an unwanted thought. Time to go home. Before I could process what that meant, I found myself moving toward the van, not walking. My feet barely touched the ground. The sensation was like being pulled by an invisible current, gentle but irresistible. I tried to speak, to protest, but my voice caught in my throat like a fishhook snagging on bone. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut with finality that echoed in my chest. The interior was larger than it should have been, stretching back into shadows that seemed to have physical weight. The seats were arranged in rows that extended further than the van's exterior dimensions could accommodate, filled with other passengers who sat in perfect stillness. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I sensed their presence like pressure changes before a storm. The van began to move. Through the windows, I watched the familiar streets of my neighborhood slide past, but something was wrong with the geometry. Buildings stretched and compressed like images in a funhouse mirror. Streets that should have led downtown curved back on themselves in impossible loops. The traffic lights blinked in sequences that hurt to follow, cycling through colors that had no names. I tried to remember how I'd gotten here, but the memories felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I'd been walking home from work, hadn't I? Or had I been walking to work? The fluorescent lights had been flickering, or maybe they'd been steady. The more I concentrated, the more the details seemed to shift and blur. The van took a right turn onto a street that definitely hadn't existed moments before. The buildings here were familiar yet wrong, My apartment complex, but with too many windows. The coffee shop, but the sign was written in letters that squirmed when I tried to read them. It was like seeing my neighborhood through water. Everything recognizable but distorted. "You've been traveling the wrong paths," the voice said, and I still couldn't determine its source. The other passengers remained motionless, their breathing synchronized in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. Taking shortcuts through time you weren't meant to find. I wanted to deny it, but fragments of memory began to surface. Walking down an alley that had led me home 15 minutes faster than it should have. Taking a stairwell in the office building that somehow skipped the third floor entirely. Moments when I'd arrived places before I'd left. When clocks had moved backward while I wasn't looking. The van's interior seemed to pulse with each revelation, the walls breathing like living tissue. The other passengers turned their heads toward me in perfect unison, their faces still obscured, but their attention tangible as heat from an oven. I could feel their silent judgment, their recognition of what I was, what we all were. "You disrupted the flow," the voice continued, and now I was certain it came from the van itself, vibrating through the seats and floor. "Stepped outside the stream, used pathways that bend time instead of space." The memories came faster now, more vivid. The morning I'd taken what I thought was a shortcut through the park and emerged at my office before my alarm had even gone off. The evening I'd walked into a restaurant and found myself already seated at a table, the waiter bringing food I hadn't ordered but somehow expected. The gradual realization that time around me had become fluid, malleable, responsive to my unconscious desires for efficiency. "We collect the deviants," the voice explained with something that might have been pride. "Those who slip through the cracks, who find the spaces between seconds and make them home." The van turned onto another impossible street, this one lined with houses that existed in different decades simultaneously. I saw my childhood home as it had been 20 years ago, complete with the tire swing my father had hung from the oak tree. Next to it stood the same house as it would be in another 20 years, the tree gone, the yard paved over for additional parking. I realized that everyone in the van, every silent, shadowy passenger, had made the same mistake I had. We'd all found ways to cheat time, to take shortcuts that shouldn't exist, and now we were paying the price. But what that price was, I still didn't understand. "Where are you taking us?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded strange in the van's peculiar acoustics, both muffled and amplified. "Nowhere," came the response. "Everywhere. Time isn't a river, it's a web. You pulled threads loose. Now you exist in the spaces between." The van passed a 24-hour diner where the clock above the door showed all time simultaneously, its hands spinning in every direction. Through the windows, I could see customers eating meals that aged and renewed themselves in endless cycles, their conversations playing backward and forward like a broken recording. I began to understand. We weren't being taken somewhere. We were being kept away from somewhere. From the normal flow of time, from the regulated progression of moments that everyone else experienced. We'd stepped outside the stream, and now we couldn't find our way back. "I never changed anything important," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. How could I know what ripples my temporal shortcuts had created? How many small delays had I avoided? How many chance encounters had I missed by arriving too early or too late? "Prove it," the voice challenged, and suddenly the van's interior filled with screens, or maybe they were windows or mirrors. Each surface showed a different moment from my life, but not as I remembered them. In one, I saw myself taking the long way home from work, arriving just as my neighbor's cat darted into traffic. In the timeline where I'd taken my shortcut, the cat lay motionless in the street. In another screen, I watched myself waiting in line at the coffee shop, instead of bypassing it through my temporal detour. Behind me in line stood a woman I'd never seen, but whose face suggested she might have been important to someone else's story. The images multiplied, showing cascading chains of consequence. Every shortcut I'd taken had created absences, gaps where I should have been but wasn't. People who should have met didn't. Conversations that should have happened were lost. Small kindnesses that should have been offered remained unspoken. You see now, the voice said with satisfaction. Every deviation creates damage. Every shortcut cuts someone else's story short. But as I watched the screens, I began to notice something else. For every negative consequence, there seemed to be a positive one. The accident I'd prevented by not being there to startle the cat. The argument I'd avoided by not hearing it in the coffee shop. The robbery I'd unwittingly prevented by not providing the distraction the thief needed. It goes both ways, I said, my confidence growing. The disruptions weren't just harmful. Some of them prevented worse things from happening. The van's interior shuddered, and I felt the other passengers stir for the first time since I'd boarded. The voice, when it came again, carried a note of uncertainty. That is not how the collection process works. Maybe the collection process is flawed, I pressed on. Maybe time isn't as fragile as you think. Maybe it can handle a few shortcuts without unraveling. The screens began to flicker, showing new images. Timelines where my presence or absence had created neither good nor bad outcomes, just different ones. Realities where the web of time had absorbed my deviations and woven them into new patterns, stronger for the variation. The van began to slow. This is unprecedented, the voice admitted, and for the first time it sounded almost human. The temporal architecture shouldn't be able to accommodate such analysis. I looked around at the other passengers, and for the first time I could see their faces. They were ordinary people, like me. Office workers and teachers, parents and students, all of whom had somehow stumbled into time's hidden pathways and found themselves collected for their transgressions. "Let us go," I said. "All of us. We're not deviants. We're explorers, and time is vast enough to accommodate exploration." The van came to a complete stop. Outside the windows, I could see my street, the real one, not the distorted version we'd been traveling through. The familiar buildings stood in their proper proportions. The streetlights cast normal shadows, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the ordinary sounds of traffic and conversation. "This concludes the collection cycle," the voice said, but it sounded different now. Tired, perhaps, or confused. "Please exit in an orderly fashion." The door swung open, and natural light flooded the van's interior. One by one, the passengers began to file out, their faces showing the same bewilderment I felt. I waited until last, then turned back to address the darkness where the driver sat. "Who are you?" I asked. The shadow that might have been a person shifted slightly. When it spoke, the voice was smaller, more vulnerable than before. "I used to be someone who took shortcuts too, but I took one too many, went too far outside the stream. Now I'm part of the collection mechanism, part of the system that tries to keep the timeline stable." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "How long have you been driving this van?" "I don't remember. Time works differently when you're this far outside it, but I think maybe the system isn't as necessary as we believed. Maybe time is more resilient than we feared." I stepped out of the van and onto the sidewalk. The door began to swing shut, but I caught it. "What happens now?" I asked. "I don't know," the driver admitted. "This has never happened before. Maybe I keep collecting. Maybe I don't. Maybe time finds a new equilibrium." The door closed, and the van pulled away from the curb. I watched its taillights disappear around the corner, back into the maze of impossible streets that existed between the seconds. I walked the remaining block to my apartment, taking the long way, staying firmly within the normal flow of time. But as I climbed the stairs to my door, I noticed something strange. The building's fluorescent lights weren't flickering anymore. They burned steady and bright, as if some cosmic circuit had finally found its proper connection. Inside my apartment, I checked my watch against the wall clock, the microwave display, my phone. All showed the same time, synchronized and orderly. But sometimes, when I wasn't looking directly at them, I could swear I saw the seconds move backward, just for an instant, as if time itself was still learning how to accommodate the small rebellions of people like me. I never took another temporal shortcut, but I never forgot that they existed. And sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet, I could hear the distant rumble of a gray van traveling streets that don't appear on any map, collecting those who wander too far from time's designated paths. Whether the driver was still the same shadow I'd spoken to, or whether the van had found new purpose in a more flexible universe, I couldn't say. But I hoped that somewhere in the spaces between seconds, a tired traveler had finally found their way home. The question that haunted me most wasn't whether the experience had been real or imagined. It was simpler and more terrifying. If time could be bent by accident, what else might I have been doing unconsciously all my life? And in a universe where shortcuts through time were possible, how could anyone ever be certain that the reality they experienced was the one they were meant to inhabit? I kept these questions to myself, but they followed me through every ordinary day that came after, a reminder that the world was stranger and more malleable than it appeared. And sometimes, when I was walking home from work and heard the particular silence that preceded the van's engine, I would quicken my pace and take the long way, staying safely within the bounds of linear time. But I never stopped listening for that silence, and I never stopped wondering what other impossible vehicles might be traveling the hidden roads between moments, collecting those who dared to step outside the stream of ordinary existence. Story 6. The buzzing started 3 weeks after I moved into the studio. At first, I blamed the building's ancient electrical system. The basement apartment came cheap for Seattle standards, tucked beneath a brick structure that predated the Great Regrade. The landlord had mentioned quirks when he handed over the keys, but the rent was half what I'd pay anywhere else in the city, and I needed every dollar I could save. The sound emerged from behind the bathroom mirror, a low mechanical hum that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. It wasn't constant. Sometimes I'd brush my teeth in perfect silence. Other times the vibration would start mid-rinse, making my molars ache. I'd tap the mirror's surface, expecting to find loose mounting screws, but the glass sat flush against the wall. The building superintendent, a weathered man named Kowalski, shrugged when I mentioned it. "Old pipes," he muttered, not looking up from his clipboard. "Steam heating. Sometimes the pressure builds up." But steam pipes didn't explain why the buzzing only occurred when I was alone. I began timing it. The sound never lasted more than 15 minutes, never started before 9 p.m. or after 3 a.m. It followed no pattern I could discern, yet something about its occurrence felt deliberately timed. Watching. Waiting. On a rainy Thursday evening, the buzzing grew so intense that the mirror itself began to vibrate. The surface trembled like water disturbed by a stone, creating subtle ripples that distorted my reflection. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the vibration travel up my arm and settle in my chest like a second heartbeat. The mounting brackets were old-fashioned, held by brass screws that had turned green with age. I found a screwdriver in the kitchen junk drawer and began working them loose. The first screw came out easily, but the second fought me, the metal groaning as if it had been undisturbed for decades. When the mirror finally came away from the wall, I nearly dropped it. Behind the silvered glass lay not pipes or electrical conduits, but a tunnel. The passage stretched back into darkness, lined with the same brick as the building's exterior walls. Cool air drifted from its depths, carrying scents of damp earth and something else. Something organic and sweet, like decay. I set the mirror carefully against the bathroom wall and retrieved my phone's flashlight. The tunnel extended farther than my light could reach, but after perhaps 20 feet, I could make out another reflective surface blocking the passage. Another mirror. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations. Hidden maintenance access. Forgotten architectural feature. Some remnant of the building's construction that had been sealed away and lost to time. But rational explanations couldn't account for the careful craftsmanship of the passage or the way the air moved through it with purposeful circulation. I squeezed through the opening behind my bathroom mirror. The tunnel was just wide enough for my shoulders, the brick walls smooth as if they'd been recently cleaned. My footsteps echoed strangely, the sound bouncing back with subtle distortions that made each step seem to multiply. The mirror at the tunnel's end reflected my approaching light in fractured patterns. As I drew closer, details became visible on its surface, scratches in the glass that formed intricate symbols, carved with deliberate precision. The patterns seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. I pressed my face close to the glass and cupped my hands around my eyes to peer through. The room beyond was identical to my studio apartment. Same layout, same furniture, same water stain on the ceiling above the kitchenette. But where I expected to see my own bathroom, I found 3 figures seated around my dining table, writing in notebooks. They wore my clothes, had my face, moved with my gestures, but something in their posture was wrong, too deliberate, too studied. As I watched, one of them looked up from his notes and glanced toward what would be his bathroom. His eyes met mine through the glass, and he smiled. It was my smile, but emptied of any warmth I recognized. The other 2 stopped writing and turned toward the mirror. All 3 of my doppelgangers studied me with the detached interest of researchers observing a lab specimen. One pointed to something in his notebook and showed it to the others. They nodded in unison. I stumbled backward through the tunnel, my phone's light dancing wildly across the brick walls. When I reached my bathroom, I hefted the mirror back into place and drove the screws in with shaking hands. The brass fixtures squealed against the wall as I over-tightened them, but I didn't stop until the screwdriver's handle bent. That night, I dreamed of taking notes. In the dream, I sat at my dining table with perfect posture, documenting the behavior of a man who looked exactly like me. The man brushed his teeth for precisely 2 minutes and 30 seconds. He checked his phone 14 times before midnight. He touched his left ear when nervous, a habit I'd never noticed in myself. I woke with the taste of ink on my tongue. The sensation persisted through the morning, metallic and sharp. When I examined my fingers, I found faint stains beneath my nails, dark smudges that resembled dried ink but wouldn't wash away completely. I spent 20 minutes scrubbing them with a toothbrush, but traces remained, embedded too deep in the skin to remove. At work, my coworkers began commenting on changes they noticed. Sarah from accounting mentioned that I seemed more focused during meetings. My supervisor praised my attention to detail, noting improvements in my report formatting that I couldn't remember making. The changes were subtle but consistent, as if someone had taken my professional behavior and refined it with surgical precision. I started leaving deliberate markers around my apartment, a coffee mug placed just so on the counter, a book open to page 47, small deviations that would reveal if anything had been disturbed while I slept. Every morning, I found the markers exactly as I'd left them. But other things had changed. My handwriting in grocery lists looked cleaner, more controlled. The contents of my refrigerator were reorganized with obsessive efficiency. My bed was made with military precision, corners tucked tighter than I'd ever managed. The improvements felt like accusations. 3 days after discovering the tunnel, the buzzing returned. I sat on my couch, staring at the bathroom door, as the sound grew more insistent. This time, I could hear additional noises beneath the mechanical hum, scratching sounds, like pencils moving across paper. I pressed my ear to the bathroom wall and listened. The scratching came in bursts, punctuated by periods of silence that felt pregnant with observation. Occasionally, I heard what might have been whispered conversation, voices that carried the cadence of my own speech but with words I couldn't quite distinguish. When I finally worked up the courage to remove the mirror again, all 3 figures were writing furiously. Their notebooks were fuller now, pages dense with annotations. One of them held what appeared to be a detailed floor plan of my apartment, marked with arrows and timestamps. Another had sketched behavioral diagrams, flowcharts that mapped my daily routines with scientific precision. The third was drawing my face from memory, but the proportions were wrong. The features were mine, but arranged with subtle differences that made the result distinctly other. As I watched, he erased the eyes and redrew them with a more vacant expression. They were perfecting me. I tried to get their attention, tapping on the glass and waving my phone's light. The figures paused in their writing but didn't look up. Instead, they consulted their notebooks and made additional notes, as if my behavior was another data point to be recorded and analyzed. That night, I woke up standing in my kitchen. I had no memory of leaving bed, but there I was at 3:17 a.m., staring at my reflection in the microwave's dark screen. My posture was wrong, too straight, shoulders squared in a way that felt unnatural. When I tried to relax, The position felt alien, as if I were wearing someone else's skeleton. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room chair, afraid to sleep. Every shadow seemed to shift with purpose. Every creak of the building settling felt like footsteps in the walls. The familiar sounds of my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic, had been replaced by a silence so complete it felt aggressive. As dawn approached, exhaustion won. I dozed in the chair, but my dreams were filled with the sensation of being watched. In the dream, I was simultaneously the observer and the observed, taking notes on my own sleeping form while experiencing the vulnerability of being studied without consent. I woke to find fresh ink stains on my fingers. The stains were darker now, and when I examined them closely, I could make out partial letter forms. Fragments of handwriting that looked like mine but felt foreign. The letter "or" curved differently than I remembered. The G had a tail that descended too far. I spent the morning practicing my own signature, but couldn't replicate the subtle differences I was seeing. It was as if someone had studied my handwriting and improved upon it, correcting flaws I'd never noticed. The notebook appeared on my dining table that afternoon. I'd left the apartment for exactly 43 minutes to buy groceries. When I returned, a leather-bound journal sat beside my laptop, open to a page covered with observations about my behavior. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, but I had no memory of making these notes. Subject exhibits mild anxiety responses when confronted with environmental changes. Recommend gradual implementation of behavioral modifications to avoid triggering defensive mechanisms. Sleep patterns remain irregular. Consider adjustment of circadian rhythm through controlled exposure to light sources. Dietary habits show potential for optimization. Subject favors convenience over nutrition. Suggest introduction of disciplined meal planning. The entries continued for pages, documenting aspects of my life with clinical detachment. My morning routine was broken down into a minute-by-minute schedule. My work productivity was tracked with graphs and statistical analysis. Even my emotional responses were cataloged and categorized, but the most disturbing entries were the ones planning future changes. Day 12. Introduce improved posture during work meetings. Gradual implementation to avoid colleague suspicion. Day 15. Optimize sleep cycle through practiced meditation techniques. Subject's current dream patterns are inefficient. Day 18. Begin handwriting improvements. Start with grocery lists and personal notes before progressing to professional documents. The dates aligned perfectly with the changes I'd been noticing. I tried to remember writing any of it, but the memories felt slippery, like trying to recall dreams after waking. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses, sitting at the table with pen in hand, the sensation of words flowing with unusual clarity. But the moments dissolved when I tried to examine them closely. That evening, I examined the mirror's mounting screws. They showed no sign of recent disturbance, but when I pressed my ear to the glass, I could hear the scratching sounds more clearly than ever. The note-taking had become frantic, urgent. I removed the mirror for the third time. The room beyond was bustling with activity. Not just 3 figures now, but 5. All of them wore my face, but each carried themselves differently. One stood with perfect posture, shoulders back and spine straight. Another moved with fluid precision, every gesture economical and purposeful. A third exhibited an unsettling stillness, breathing in measured intervals that seemed too controlled to be natural. They'd arranged my apartment like a research facility. Charts covered the walls, tracking everything from my caffeine intake to the number of steps I took each day. My furniture had been rearranged for optimal efficiency. Even my bookshelf was organized by a system I didn't recognize, not alphabetical or by subject, but according to some logic that seemed deeply significant to them. As I watched, one of the figures approached their mirror and began carving something into the glass. The tool in his hand looked like a dental pick, and he worked with the patience of someone performing delicate surgery. The symbols he etched were similar to the ones already present, but more complex, interconnected patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. When he finished, he placed his palm against the glass and pressed firmly. The carved symbols began to glow with a faint phosphorescence, and I felt the mirror on my side grow warm. That was when I understood. The symbols weren't just decoration. They were a mechanism, a way to thin the barrier between their reality and mine. Each carving weakened the boundary, making it easier for them to influence my world, to influence me. I stumbled backward from the mirror, but before I could retreat to my bathroom, one of the figures held up a notebook. On the visible page, written in my own improved handwriting, was a simple message. We're helping you become better. Don't fight the improvements. You'll thank us when it's complete. I ran back through the tunnel and practically threw the mirror against the wall, fumbling with the screws until my fingers bled. But even with the mirror secured, I could feel them working on the other side. The carved symbols were spreading, creating a network of connections that bypassed the physical barrier. Each night, I woke up a little less myself. My movements became more efficient. My thoughts felt cleaner, stripped of the chaotic tangents that had always characterized my inner monologue. Even my handwriting continued improving, developing a flowing consistency that felt alien despite being undeniably mine. The changes weren't unpleasant. If anything, I was becoming the version of myself I'd always wanted to be: organized, focused, deliberate. But the improvements came with a growing sense of displacement, as if I were watching someone else live my life with greater skill than I'd ever possessed. I tried sleeping in different rooms, but the effect persisted. Wherever I lost consciousness, I'd wake with new modifications. Sometimes physical. My posture had permanently improved. My sleep schedule had regulated itself to an optimal 8 hours. Sometimes mental. Complex problems at work seemed suddenly solvable. Social interactions felt more predictable and manageable. But with each improvement came a corresponding loss. The nervous habit of touching my ear disappeared, but so did the spontaneous moments of joy that used to punctuate my days. My anxiety decreased, but so did my capacity for surprise. I was becoming more effective and less alive. 2 weeks after finding the notebook, I discovered the carving tools. They appeared in my kitchen drawer, nestled among the utensils like they'd always belonged there. 3 metal picks with handles worn smooth by use. When I picked them up, my hands seemed to know exactly how to hold them, muscle memory guiding fingers that had never performed such work. I found myself walking toward the bathroom before I realized what I was doing. The compulsion was gentle but insistent, like hunger or thirst. My rational mind screamed warnings, but my body moved with purpose. I removed the mirror's screws with practiced efficiency, as if I'd done it hundreds of times before. The tunnel seemed shorter now, the journey to the far mirror requiring only a few steps. The glass surface was covered with fresh carvings, symbols that had multiplied and grown more complex since my last visit. Some glowed with that same faint phosphorescence. Others seemed to absorb light, creating patches of darkness that hurt to look at directly. On the other side, my 5 alternates worked in perfect coordination. They'd established a sophisticated operation, with charts and graphs covering every available surface. But now their notebooks contained more than behavioral observations. They were filled with architectural diagrams, complex formulas, and detailed plans for something I couldn't quite comprehend. When they saw me approaching, all 5 looked up simultaneously and smiled. "Your turn," one of them mouthed through the glass. I understood then what was happening. They weren't just observing and improving me. They were taking turns being me. Each night, one of them would cross over while I slept, living my life for a few hours before returning to document the experience. They were learning to be me better than I was, and now they wanted me to join their rotation. I raised the carving tool and pressed its point against the glass. The symbol that emerged seemed to carve itself, following patterns that felt ancient and inevitable. As I worked, warmth spread through the mirror's surface, and the barrier between worlds grew thin. Part of me wanted to complete the carving. The promise of optimization was seductive, to become the best possible version of myself, refined through collective effort. But something deeper, some stubborn core of imperfection, rebelled against the idea. I was flawed. I was inefficient. I touched my ear when nervous and made grocery lists with inconsistent handwriting. But these flaws were mine, earned through decades of stumbling towards something resembling personhood. I stepped back from the mirror. The 5 figures on the other side looked disappointed but not surprised. One of them held up a notebook with a message already prepared. "You'll change your mind eventually. We're patient. We're you." I retreated through the tunnel and mounted the mirror for what I hoped would be the final time. But as I tightened the screws, I could feel the carved symbols pulsing behind the glass. The connection had been established. The work would continue whether I participated or not. That night I woke up with perfect posture and found a grocery list written in flawless handwriting. I still live in the basement studio. The rent is too good to leave, and part of me wonders if I could leave even if I wanted to. Each morning I discover small improvements to my life. My apartment cleaner, my schedule more organized, my social interactions more polished. Sometimes I catch glimpses of my reflection moving just slightly out of sync with my actual movements. Sometimes I find notes in my handwriting that I don't remember making. Sometimes I wake up with ink under my fingernails and the taste of metal on my tongue. The buzzing behind the mirror has stopped, but I know they're still there. Still watching, still taking notes, still working to perfect the art of being me. I've learned to live with the improvements, even as they slowly erase the person I used to be. After all, they're helping me become better. And perhaps that's what I always wanted. Perhaps I've been them all along. Story 7. The grandfather clock in the lobby had been striking the wrong time for 3 weeks, but management insisted it added character to the Merchants and Planters Bank. Character. That's what they called the water stains that bloomed like bruises across the ceiling, the way the fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical wheeze, and how the building seemed to exhale the mustiness of a century's worth of secrets every time the heavy oak doors swung open. I should have quit after the first week. Should have listened to my gut when I walked through those doors and felt the weight of something watching, waiting. But night shift work paid better than anything else I could find in Savannah, and the old bank needed someone willing to sit alone with its ghosts from midnight to dawn. The job was simple enough. Monitor the security system, do the books, handle any late deposits from the Dropbox. Simple, mindless work that left plenty of time to read or catch up on sleep between the hourly rounds. The kind of job perfect for someone trying to disappear from the world for 8 hours at a time. That was before 1:03 a.m. became the most terrifying 3 minutes of my existence. It started on a Tuesday, or was it Wednesday? The nights blur together when you work the graveyard shift, each one bleeding into the next like watercolors in rain. I was reconciling the day's transactions when the motion sensors triggered in the main lobby. Nothing unusual there. The system was ancient and temperamental, prone to phantom readings from settling foundations or passing cars. But when I glanced at the monitor, 3 figures stood before the entrance turnstiles. 3 figures in dark hoodies, faces obscured, bodies unnaturally still. The image quality was poor. The cameras dated back to the Clinton administration, but I could make out their shapes clearly enough. They stood in perfect formation, the middle one slightly forward, like some twisted military formation. My hand moved to the silent alarm button, but something made me pause. They weren't moving, weren't trying the doors or examining the locks, just standing there, waiting. I switched to the exterior camera and felt my stomach drop. The street was empty. No car, no van, nothing to indicate how they'd arrived. The timestamp on the footage read 1:03 a.m. When I switched back to the lobby camera, they were gone. I told myself it was a glitch. Old equipment, tired eyes, too much coffee, and not enough sleep. But my hands shook as I made my rounds that night, and every shadow seemed to writhe with possibility. The next night, they returned. Same time, same formation, same impossible stillness. This time I watched the exterior camera first, still nothing, then switched to the lobby. There they were, motionless sentries in the fluorescent gloom. I grabbed the phone to call the police, but as my fingers found the numbers, the figures began to move. Not toward the doors or windows, but directly toward the turnstiles. And then, Christ, I can still feel the chill that crawled up my spine. They walked through them. Not around, not over, through. Like mist passing through metal bars, Their bodies simply flowed between the solid steel bars without resistance. The turnstiles didn't move, didn't click, didn't register their passage in any way. They materialized on the other side and continued their slow, deliberate advance toward the teller windows. I slammed my hand on the alarm button. Nothing. The red light didn't even flicker. The system that had triggered from a paper cup blowing past the window last week refused to acknowledge 3 intruders moving through the lobby. By the time I looked back at the monitor, they were gone again. I called in sick the next day and spent the afternoon in the bank's basement archives, digging through boxes of old records that hadn't seen daylight in decades. My supervisor thought I was being thorough, checking historical transaction patterns for discrepancies. The truth was, I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if something else was happening in that building. The records went back to the bank's founding in 1887, but what I found was buried in a manila folder marked Incident Reports, 1923. The paper was yellow and brittle, the ink faded to brown, but the words were clear enough. October 23, 1923, 1:03 a.m. Attempted robbery by 3 masked individuals. Suspects breached lobby, but failed to access vault area. No arrests made. Investigation ongoing. Note: witnesses report suspects vanished before police arrival. Security guard claims perpetrators walked through locked doors. Recommends psychological evaluation for guard. October 24, 1923, 1:03 a.m. Second attempted breach reported by replacement guard. Same description of suspects. Investigation extended. October 25, 1923, 1:03 a.m. Third incident. Pattern established. Recommend closure of overnight operations pending resolution. The reports continued for 2 weeks, each one documenting the same impossible event. 3 hooded figures appearing at 1:03 a.m., attempting to reach what the reports called the vault area, then vanishing without explanation. After the 14th incident, the report stopped. No resolution, no arrest, no explanation. I flipped through more papers and found architectural blueprints from the original construction. The building had been remodeled extensively over the decades, but one detail caught my attention. The basement extended far deeper than the current floor plan suggested. There were rooms down there that no longer existed on any current blueprint, including something labeled simply as Secure Storage, Vault Access. That night, I arrived early and used my master key to explore the basement. Most of it had been converted to climate-controlled document storage, but in the furthest corner behind a wall of filing cabinets, I found a door that shouldn't have existed. It was older than the rest of the building, made of heavy steel, with an elaborate combination lock that looked like something from a Wild West bank. No rust, no wear, as if it had been installed yesterday despite clearly being decades old. Above the lock, barely visible in the dim light, were words etched into the metal. Ethereal Holdings, 1923. I tried the handle. Locked, of course. But as my fingers touched the cold metal, I felt something, a vibration like a heartbeat trapped in steel. The sensation traveled up my arm and settled in my chest, a thrumming presence that felt alive. Upstairs, 1:03 a.m. approached with the inevitability of a funeral march. I watched the monitors with new understanding as the 3 figures materialized in the lobby. This time I could see their faces, or rather the absence of faces beneath their hoods. Just shadow and suggestion, as if they were sketched in charcoal and partially erased. They moved with purpose now, no longer stopping at the turnstiles, but flowing through them like water through a sieve. Across the lobby, toward the stairs that led to the basement. Toward me. I should have run, should have fled the building and never looked back. Instead, I found myself walking to meet them, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Each step felt heavy, like walking through honey, and the air grew thicker as they approached. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, they stopped. The center figure raised one arm, translucent I could see through it to the wall behind, and pointed toward the hidden door. No words, but somehow I understood. They wanted in, had been trying to get in for almost a century, and somehow, impossibly, they needed me to open it. The combination lock clicked under my fingers without conscious thought, numbers appearing in my mind as if they'd always been there. 10-23-23, the date of their original attempt. The door swung open to reveal a room that shouldn't have existed, filled with objects that defied explanation. Not money or jewelry, but things that seemed to exist between states, solid and transparent, present and absent, real and imagined. The ethereal holdings the door promised. As I stepped inside, the three figures followed, and for the first time in nearly a century, they seemed complete, solid, real. The room filled with the sound of their success, not voices but something deeper, like satisfaction given form. They moved among the ethereal objects with familiar efficiency, as if they had done this countless times before in their endless loop of interrupted purpose. And then I understood the truth that made my sanity fracture like ice in spring. This wasn't the first time I had opened that door. The weight of repetition pressed down on me, memories that weren't quite memories surfacing like bubbles in black water. How many times had I played this scene? How many nights had I discovered the same records, opened the same door, watched the same figures finally complete their century-old task? The grandfather clock in the lobby began to chime, but the sound was wrong, too deep, too resonant, as if it were ringing not just in the present but across all the nights that had come before. One chime, two, three, and then silence. The monitors upstairs flickered back to life, showing an empty lobby. The motion sensors reset. The security system hummed back to normal operation as if nothing had happened. But I remained in the basement room with its impossible contents, watching as the three figures faded like morning mist, their purpose finally fulfilled until tomorrow night, when the cycle would begin again. I checked my watch. 1:06 a.m. The grandfather clock upstairs began to chime again. 1, 2, 3. 1:03 a.m. I was walking back upstairs to my desk, to the monitors, to the moment when three figures would appear in the lobby for the first time. Again. The knowledge sat heavy in my mind like lead, but even as I recognized the loop, I felt my awareness of it beginning to slip away, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. By the time I reached my desk, I had almost forgotten why I felt so tired, why my hands shook slightly as I reached for my coffee cup. Just another quiet night at the Merchants and Planters Bank, where the grandfather clock kept the wrong time and the building exhaled its century of secrets into the fluorescent-lit darkness. The motion sensors triggered in the main lobby. I glanced at the monitor, expecting nothing more than another false alarm, and saw three figures standing before the entrance turnstiles. Three figures in dark hoodies, faces obscured, bodies unnaturally still. My hand moved toward the silent alarm button, then paused. Something about them seemed familiar, like a half-remembered dream that clings to the edges of consciousness. But that was impossible. I'd never seen them before in my life. Had I? Outside, the grandfather clock in the lobby began to chime, and I realized with growing unease that I couldn't remember if this was the first time I'd seen them, or the 1000th. The distinction seemed important, but every time I tried to grasp the thought, it slipped away like smoke through my fingers. The timestamp on the monitor read 1:03 a.m., and somewhere in the basement, behind a door I was certain I'd never seen before, something ethereal waited in the darkness for someone to let it free. Story 8. The Catskill Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their ancient peaks shrouded in a mist that seemed to cling to the earth like something alive. I had chosen this place for its isolation, for the way it promised to cut us off from the world and all its distractions. Sarah deserved that much, a weekend where I could finally give her the attention she'd been craving, where I could prove that my promises weren't just empty words thrown into the wind. The cabin sat perched on a narrow ledge, accessible only by a winding dirt road that had tested my sedan's suspension to its limits. Rustic hardly did it justice. The structure looked as though it had been carved directly from the mountainside, its weathered logs dark with age and moisture. Sarah had stepped out of the car with obvious skepticism, her designer boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "This is it?" she had asked, though her tone carried more curiosity than complaint. I had assured her it would be perfect, that sometimes perfect meant stepping away from comfort. Now, as I struggled to coax flames from the stubborn kindling in the massive stone fireplace, I wondered if I'd been too optimistic. The wood was damp, reluctant to catch despite my increasingly frustrated attempts. Sarah busied herself unpacking our supplies, her movements efficient but distant. The silence between us had grown heavier over the past weeks, weighted with unspoken expectations and my own mounting anxiety. The proposal had been spontaneous. Too spontaneous, perhaps. The words had tumbled out during a quiet dinner, prompted by her tears over yet another friend's engagement announcement. She had said yes, of course, her face lighting up with a joy that made my chest tight with both love and panic. But the ring remained unbought, sitting in my browser's shopping cart like a digital sword of Damocles. Every time I tried to finalize the purchase, something stopped me. The price, maybe, or the commitment it represented, or simply the voice in my head that whispered I wasn't ready, that I was fooling myself and her both. Finally, a small flame caught hold, licking tentatively at the dry bark I'd found beneath the cabin's eaves. I fed it carefully, adding progressively larger pieces until a proper fire began to take shape. The warmth felt good against my face, and I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction before the wood began to pop and hiss in earnest. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks, shadows dancing in the flickering light. But as the flames grew stronger and more consistent, the marks became unmistakable. Burned into the wooden mantelpiece and extending down onto the hearthstone were deep grooves, not carved, but seared, as though something with claws had raked across the surface while the wood was burning. The marks formed a rough pattern, curving lines that seemed to spiral outward from the fireplace itself. I traced them with my finger, feeling the smooth carbon-black depressions. They were old, clearly, the wood around them weathered to match the rest of the mantel. But they hadn't been visible until the fire had heated the wood enough to make them stand out against the grain. "Sarah," I called, trying to keep my voice casual. "Come look at this." She joined me at the hearth, her expression shifting from mild interest to puzzlement as she followed my pointing finger. Her hand found my arm, grip tightening slightly as she studied the burned marks. "What do you think made those?" she asked. I had no answer. The grooves were too deep and too purposeful to be accidental, too organic to be decorative. They looked like claw marks, but no animal I could think of would have been able to burn them into seasoned hardwood. A knock at the cabin door interrupted my speculation. I hadn't heard a vehicle approach, but the mountains played tricks with sound, and I'd been focused on the fire. Sarah and I exchanged glances before I moved to answer. The man standing on our narrow porch looked as weathered as the cabin itself. Elderly but sturdy, with the kind of deep tan that spoke of decades working outdoors. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, took in both of us before settling on my face. "Evening, folks. Name's Connor Marsh. I look after the properties up here." His voice carried the flat vowels of upstate New York, tinged with something that might have been Irish generations removed. "Saw your smoke and thought I'd check in. Make sure you folks were settling in all right." I introduced myself and Sarah, noting how Connor's gaze lingered on the interior of the cabin, specifically the fireplace. Something flickered across his features, recognition perhaps, or concern. "First time up here?" he asked. When I confirmed it was, Connor nodded slowly, his attention still drawn to the burning logs. The claw marks were clearly visible now, the heat having brought them into sharp relief against the wood. "Might I come in for a moment? There's something you ought to know about this place." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. Sarah had moved closer to the fire, her arms wrapped around herself despite the growing warmth. Connor entered slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "You've noticed the marks," he said, not making it a question. "We were just wondering about them," Sarah replied. "Do you know what made them?" Connor was quiet for a long moment, studying the burned grooves with the intensity of someone reading a familiar text. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "This land has a history. The local tribes, before they were driven out, they had stories about this ridge, called it the place where promises went to die." He gestured toward the marks. "They show up when the fire gets hot enough. Been doing it for as long as anyone can remember." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What kind of promises? The romantic kind, mostly. Vows that got broken, commitments that fell through. The stories say there's something that dwells here, something that feeds on that particular kind of betrayal. Connor's eyes met mine directly. They called it the wandering solstice, said it collected debts. Sarah's laugh was nervous, artificial. That's just folklore, right? Local color for the tourists? Connor's expression didn't change. Maybe, but I've been caretaking these cabins for 37 years, and I've seen enough to know that some stories stick around because they're true. He moved closer to the fireplace, pointing to where the claw marks seemed to spiral outward from the hearth. In the dancing firelight, the pattern almost seemed to move, the lines shifting and writhing like something alive. The marks always appear in the same pattern. See how they curve away from the fire? They're not random. They're pointing somewhere. His finger traced the path of the burns, and I realized with growing unease that the marks seemed to flow toward the cabin's single bedroom, spiraling around the bed like some kind of supernatural navigation chart. Look, I said, forcing rationality into my voice. This is interesting folklore, but... You proposed to her recently, didn't you? Connor interrupted, his pale eyes boring into mine. But you haven't sealed the deal, haven't made it official. The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah's sharp intake of breath told me she'd felt it too. How could this stranger possibly know about our situation? I don't understand how that's any of your business, I managed. Connor's smile was sad, sympathetic even. It becomes my business when couples come up here with unfinished promises. The wandering solstice, it can sense that kind of debt, draws it like blood draws sharks. The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. In the sudden flare of light, the claw marks seemed deeper, more pronounced. Sarah moved closer to me, her shoulder pressing against my arm. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying that if there's a promise between you two that hasn't been properly kept, you might want to consider leaving tonight, before sunrise." Connor's voice carried a weight of absolute sincerity that made my skin crawl. "Or if you're staying, you'll need to protect yourselves." Protect ourselves from what? The question came out more sharply than I'd intended. From having your debt collected. Connor moved to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond. The wandering solstice appears during the longest nights, when the veil between intention and action is thinnest. It takes what's owed to it. Sarah's grip on my arm had become painful. What does that mean exactly? Connor turned back to us, his weathered face grave. It means that broken promises have consequences, and sometimes those consequences come looking for payment. The rational part of my mind rebelled against what I was hearing. This was folklore, superstition, the kind of campfire story designed to spook tourists and give local caretakers something mysterious to talk about. But the claw marks were real, burned deep into wood that had no business showing such markings. And Connor's knowledge of our situation felt impossible to dismiss as coincidence. "Let's say we believe you," I said carefully. "What exactly are you suggesting we do?" "If you're determined to stay, there's an old ritual. Local tribes used it when they had to camp on cursed ground." Connor gestured toward the fireplace. "Seal the chimney with salted embers before dawn. Burns out the spiritual pathways, breaks the connection. But it has to be done before the first bird song, or it won't hold." He reached into his jacket and produced a small canvas bag, the kind used for storing bulk spices. "Rock salt. You'll need to heat it in the coals until it glows, then pack it tight in the chimney opening. Should buy you protection until you can leave in the morning." The bag felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. The salt inside was coarse, gray-white crystals that caught the firelight like tiny prisms. "This is insane," I muttered, but even as I said it, I found myself studying the bag with growing interest. Connor moved toward the door, his purpose apparently fulfilled. "Maybe it is, but insanity's better than regret, in my experience." He paused at the threshold, looking back at us with something that might have been pity. "Fair warning, it gets active around midnight. If you hear scratching in the walls or movement in the bedroom, don't investigate. Just tend the fire and wait for dawn. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sarah and me alone with the crackling fire and the increasingly prominent claw marks. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending tree branches scraping against the cabin's roof with sounds that could easily be mistaken for something else entirely. "Tell me you don't believe any of that," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. I wanted to reassure her, to dismiss Connor's warnings as elaborate theater designed to enhance our mountain experience. But the weight of the salt bag in my hand felt real, and the guilt that had been gnawing at me for weeks suddenly seemed to take on a more ominous dimension. "I don't know what I believe," I admitted. The fire had grown hot enough that the claw marks now stood out in stark relief, their spiraling pattern seeming to pulse with each flicker of the flames. Sarah followed my gaze to the marks, then to the bedroom doorway where the burns seemed to point. "Maybe we should just leave," she suggested quietly. Part of me wanted to agree, to pack our things and drive back down the treacherous mountain road in the dark, rather than spend another hour in this place. But leaving felt like admitting defeat, like confirming that I was exactly the kind of man who made promises he couldn't keep, and ran when confronted with the consequences. "We're not going anywhere," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "This is just folklore, local color. We came here for a romantic weekend, and that's what we're going to have." Sarah studied my face in the firelight, and I wondered what she saw there. Determination? Stubbornness? Or just the desperation of a man trying to convince himself that his doubts and delays were justified? "Okay," she said finally. "But if things get weird, I mean really weird, we're leaving. I don't care if it's 3 a.m. I agreed, though privately I doubted anything genuinely supernatural would manifest. The claw marks had a rational explanation, I was sure. Wood grain, natural stress patterns, previous damage that only became visible under certain conditions. Connor's knowledge of our situation was more troubling, but not impossible to explain. Small communities thrived on gossip, and Sarah had probably mentioned our engagement to someone who'd passed the information along. The evening progressed with forced normalcy. We shared the bottle of wine I'd brought, ate the expensive cheese and crackers Sarah had selected, and tried to maintain the romantic atmosphere I'd originally envisioned. But the claw marks dominated the room's visual space, their spiraling pattern drawing the eye like an optical illusion that refused to resolve into something comprehensible. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed that the marks seemed to be extending beyond their original boundaries. What had started as burns confined to the mantelpiece now appeared to continue onto the nearby wall, fainter but unmistakably present. I blinked hard, wondering if the wine was affecting my vision, but the extended pattern remained visible. "Sarah," I said carefully, "look at the wall next to the fireplace." She followed my gaze, her intake of breath confirming that I wasn't imagining things. The claw marks definitely extended beyond their original location, spiraling outward in the same purposeful pattern. "That wasn't there before," she whispered. I wanted to argue, to find a rational explanation, but the evidence was undeniable. The marks were spreading, following their mysterious logic toward the bedroom where we'd planned to spend the night. A scratching sound from within the walls made us both freeze. It started softly, barely audible over the crackling fire, but grew progressively louder and more distinct. Something was moving inside the cabin's structure, following a path that seemed to mirror the claw mark's spiraling pattern. "What is that?" Sarah's voice was tight with fear. The scratching continued, a deliberate scraping that sounded disturbingly like claws against wood. It moved around the room's perimeter, staying inside the walls but tracing a path that brought it inexorably closer to where we sat. I stood up abruptly, anger overwhelming fear. Enough of this. Moving to the front door, I yanked it open and stepped onto the porch. The mountain air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers beginning to decay. "Connor," I called into the darkness. "This isn't funny anymore." My voice echoed off the surrounding peaks, but no response came. The scratching from inside the cabin continued, now accompanied by what sounded like whispered voices speaking words I couldn't quite understand. When I turned back toward the doorway, Sarah was standing by the fireplace with the bag of salt in her hands. Her face was pale but determined. "Maybe we should try his ritual," she said. "This is ridiculous. It's probably just mice in the walls or the wood settling as it cools." But even as I spoke, I knew the explanation was inadequate. The scratching was too purposeful, too clearly directed. The whispers grew louder, resolving into what might have been my name repeated over and over in a voice that didn't quite sound human. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the salt bag. "Promise me something," I said suddenly. She looked up from the salt, her eyes wide. "Promise me that no matter what happens tonight, you'll remember that I love you, that I want to marry you, even if I've been too scared to make it official." "Why are you talking like that?" she asked, but her voice carried understanding. The unnamed tension between us was finally being acknowledged. "Because I think Connor was right about one thing. This place responds to unfinished business, and I've been carrying around a lot of that lately." The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving the cabin in a silence that felt heavier than the previous noise. In that quiet, I could hear something else, a sound like breathing, deep and rhythmic, coming from the bedroom. Sarah heard it too. Her knuckles went white around the salt bag. "We need to do this now," she said. Working together, we built up the fire until the coals glowed white hot. Sarah poured salt into a metal camping pot I'd brought, and we held it over the flames until the crystals began to glow with their own internal light. The heated salt gave off a sharp, clean smell that seemed to push back against the sweet decay that had been growing stronger. The breathing from the bedroom grew louder, accompanied by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Something was moving around our bed, circling it with the same spiral pattern shown by the claw marks. "Hurry," Sarah whispered. I grabbed the pot of glowing salt with a thick towel and moved toward the fireplace. The chimney opening was narrow, designed for a different era's heating needs. As I began packing the salt into the gap, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. It felt expectant, as though something was waiting to see whether our improvised ritual would work. I pressed more salt into the chimney, the heated crystals hissing against the cool stone. A new sound emerged from the bedroom, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I forced myself not to look toward the doorway, focusing instead on sealing every gap in the chimney opening. The salt glowed like tiny stars in the firelight, and I found myself hoping that Connor's folklore was more than just elaborate fiction. The dragging sound moved closer, entering the main room. I could feel Sarah pressed against my back, her breathing quick and shallow. Whatever was making the noise was large, moving with deliberate purpose toward where we knelt by the fireplace. "Almost done," I muttered, packing the last of the salt into place. The moment the final crystal was pressed into position, the dragging sound stopped. The oppressive atmosphere that had been building all evening seemed to lift slightly, like pressure equalizing in my ears. But the relief was temporary. From outside the cabin came a new sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all directions at once. It rose and fell with the wind, carrying notes of frustration and something that might have been grief. "Is it over?" Sarah asked. I honestly didn't know. The salt barrier felt substantial, the chimney opening thoroughly sealed. But the wailing continued, circling the cabin with increasing intensity. Whatever we were dealing with hadn't given up. It had simply been temporarily thwarted. We spent the remainder of the night huddled by the fire, feeding it constantly to maintain the heat that kept the claw marks visible and perhaps held other things at bay. The wailing came and went in waves, sometimes fading to nothing before returning with renewed fury. Occasionally, we heard scratching at the cabin's exterior walls, long scrapes that suggested something testing the structure's defenses, but the salt barrier held. Nothing entered through the sealed chimney, and gradually the interior sounds, the whispers, the breathing, the footsteps, faded away. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the cabin's windows and revealing a world that looked entirely normal. The claw marks were still visible in the wood, but they seemed static now, burned patterns rather than living things. The salt in the chimney had fused into a solid barrier, glowing faintly in the morning light. We packed quickly, saying little. The drive down the mountain was tense but uneventful, both of us eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever we'd experienced. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway that Sarah spoke. Did that really happen? I considered the question seriously. In daylight, with normal traffic flowing around us and radio stations playing familiar songs, the night's events felt increasingly surreal. But the memory of the claw marks was vivid, and my hands still smelled faintly of heated salt. I think so, I said finally. Connor was right about the debt, wasn't he? She asked quietly. About unfinished promises. The engagement ring was still sitting in my browser's shopping cart, still waiting for me to find the courage to complete the purchase. But something had changed during the night. The fear that had been holding me back seemed smaller now, less significant than the fear of losing what I already had. Yeah, I admitted. He was right. Sarah reached across the center console and took my hand. So what are we going to do about it? I pulled over at the next rest stop and used my phone to complete the purchase I'd been avoiding for weeks. The ring would arrive in 3 days, and I could propose properly, officially, without the shadow of broken promises hanging over us. But even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night hearing scratching sounds in the walls of our apartment. Sarah says it's just the building settling, pipes expanding and contracting with temperature changes. She's probably right, but I keep a small bag of salt in the kitchen cabinet, just in case. Because some debts, once acknowledged, never truly disappear. They just wait for the next opportunity to be collected. And sometimes late at night when the city is quiet, I swear I can hear something wailing in the distance, mournful and patient and endlessly persistent. The wandering solstice, Connor had called it. I'm beginning to think it followed us home. Story 9. The silence in the Appalachians isn't really silent at all. I discovered this on my 3rd day alone on the trail, when the absence of human noise became so complete that my ears began picking up sounds I'd never noticed before. The whisper of wind through dying leaves, the distant crack of settling wood, the soft percussion of my own heartbeat echoing off the valley walls, and underneath it all, something that sounded almost like footsteps. Almost. I'd come to these mountains to escape the suffocating weight of civilization, to find some clarity in the wilderness that the therapy sessions and prescription bottles couldn't provide. The divorce papers were still sitting unsigned on my kitchen table back home in Richmond, and Sarah's voice still rang in my ears with accusations I couldn't quite dispute. The trail stretched ahead for another 40 miles of solitude, promising the kind of emptiness that might finally quiet the noise in my head. But the mountains, I was learning, had their own kind of noise. The footsteps started on the 4th morning, just after I'd broken camp near Miller's Creek. At first I dismissed them as the echo of my own boots on the rocky trail, some acoustic trick of the narrow valley walls. But when I stopped to adjust my pack, they continued for 3 more steps before falling silent. When I resumed walking, they returned, always maintaining the same rhythm, the same distance behind me. I turned around several times that first day, scanning the empty trail that wound through the russet and gold forest. Nothing. Just the skeletal branches of late autumn trees and the carpet of leaves that rustled with each gust of wind. The rational part of my mind provided easy explanations. Acoustic anomalies, wildlife moving parallel to the trail, stress-induced auditory hallucinations. I'd read about such things during my recent deep dive into psychological literature, trying to understand why my world had started falling apart. But the footsteps persisted, and by evening, I noticed they were different from mine. Softer, more deliberate, and they seemed to be barefoot. That night I pitched my tent in a small clearing beside Hawkins Ridge, far enough from the creek that the water's murmur wouldn't mask any approaching sounds. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the forest settle into darkness, my ears straining for any repetition of those phantom steps. Instead, around midnight, I saw the first fire. It appeared as a small orange glow through the fabric of my tent, distant but distinct among the trees. Then another flickered to life to my left, then another behind me. Within minutes, I counted 8 separate fires arranged in what appeared to be a perfect circle around my campsite, each one burning silently in the darkness beyond the tree line. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out into the night. The fires were real enough. I could see the actual flames dancing in the cold air, casting shifting shadows against the surrounding trees. But there was no smoke, no crackling sound, no evidence of anyone tending them. They simply burned with an unnatural steadiness that made my skin crawl. I called out into the darkness, my voice hoarse with fear. The sound echoed off the ridge walls and died away, leaving only the quiet hiss of burning wood that seemed to come from all directions at once. The fires burned until dawn, winking out one by one as the first gray light filtered through the canopy. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I'd hallucinated the entire episode. When I searched the areas where the fires had appeared, I found only dead leaves and cold earth. No char marks, no ash, no sign that anything had burned. But my memory of those silent flames remained vivid, etched into my mind with the kind of clarity that felt more real than reality itself. I should have turned back then, should have hiked the 6 miles to the nearest road and caught a ride back to civilization. Instead, I pressed deeper into the mountains, driven by a combination of stubbornness and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the same impulse that had led me to stand on my apartment balcony for long minutes the night Sarah moved out, looking down at the concrete 20 stories below and wondering what falling would feel like. The trail climbed steadily through the morning, switching back and forth across the steep face of Crescent Mountain. My legs burned with the effort, and my breathing came in short gasps in the thin air. Behind me, the footsteps kept their patient pace, never falling behind, never drawing closer. When I stopped for water, they stopped. When I resumed climbing, they followed. By noon, I'd started talking to myself just to break the oppressive silence. That was when I made the mistake that would haunt me for the rest of my time in those mountains. Standing at a scenic overlook that provided a sweeping view of the valley below, I found myself speaking aloud the secret I'd kept buried for 3 years. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, as if the empty air demanded confession. I told the mountains about the night Sarah was at her sister's house, about the phone call from her best friend Emma, about the choice I'd made that destroyed everything I'd thought I loved about myself. I spoke of guilt and self-loathing, of the slow poison that had infected my marriage and my sanity. I told the wilderness what I'd never told the therapists, what I'd never told Sarah, what I'd barely admitted to myself. The mountains listened in perfect silence, absorbing my words like a sponge soaks up water. When I finished, the echo of my confession seemed to hang in the air for far longer than physics should have allowed, bouncing back and forth between the valley walls until it transformed into something unrecognizable, a whispered chant in a language I didn't understand. That evening, I found the cabin. It sat in a small depression just off the main trail, nearly invisible behind a screen of wild rhododendron and mountain laurel. The structure was old but solid, built from logs that had weathered to a silver-gray color. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, and vines had claimed most of the walls, but the door still hung on rusted hinges. Inside, the cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and narrow windows that let in just enough light to see by. Dust motes danced in the fading sunlight, and the air smelled of old wood and decay. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of rotting canvas, I found the diary. The leather cover was cracked and water-stained, but the pages inside were surprisingly well preserved. The entries were written in a careful, old-fashioned script dated from October 1963. The author identified himself only as J.M. and described a solo hiking trip through these same mountains. But as I read, the hair on the back of my neck began to rise. October 12, 1963. The footsteps began again today, just as they did during my last visit here in 58. Always the same pattern. Soft, deliberate, barefoot. When I turn to look, there's nothing. But I can feel eyes watching from the shadows between the trees. I know I should leave, but something keeps drawing me deeper into these mountains. October 15th, 1963. The fires came again last night. 8 of them, arranged in a perfect circle around my camp. They burn without smoke or sound, casting light that seems to absorb rather than illuminate. In their glow, I can almost see shapes moving in the darkness beyond. Tall, thin figures that seem to float rather than walk. I think they're waiting for something. October 18th, 1963. I understand now what draws me back to this place. It's the echo. When you speak your deepest shame to these mountains, they remember. They hold on to your words and repeat them back in whispered fragments that follow you wherever you go. The locals call it the barefoot echo, and they say it marks those who reveal their secrets to the mountain spirits. The only way to break free is to climb to Sorrow's Peak and speak your confession backward, syllable by syllable, until the echo releases its hold. October 20th, 1963. I tried to leave today, but the trail won't let me. Every path leads deeper into the mountains. Every fork takes me further from civilization. The footsteps are closer now, and I can hear my own voice whispering back to me from the darkness. Fragments of the confession I made 5 years ago, distorted and multiplied until they sound like a chorus of my own guilt. Tomorrow I climb to the peak. It's the only way. The final entry was smeared and barely legible. October 21st, 1963. It worked. God help me, it worked. But the silence afterward is worse than the whispers. In breaking the echo, I think I've broken something in myself as well. I can leave now, but I'm not sure I want to. The mountains know my secret, and now they're part of me. I think I'll stay a while longer. I think I'll stay forever. I closed the diary with trembling hands, my mind racing to process what I'd read. The similarity to my own experience was impossible to ignore, but the rational part of my brain insisted it had to be some kind of elaborate hoax. People didn't get trapped by supernatural echoes. Mountains didn't hold conversations with hikers. The entries had to be fiction, maybe something left behind by a creative writing enthusiast with a taste for local folklore. But as I sat in the gathering darkness of the abandoned cabin, I could hear my own words echoing faintly in the distance, fragments of the confession I'd made that morning, repeated in whispered snatches that seemed to come from all directions at once. The sound was growing stronger, more distinct, as if the mountains were learning to speak in my voice. I spent the night in the cabin, afraid to return to my tent and the circle of silent fires I knew would be waiting. Through the broken windows, I watched the flames appear one by one in the surrounding forest, casting their cold light across the clearing. But this time, I could see the shapes moving between them. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, their feet never quite touching the ground. The barefoot echo, J.M. had called them in his diary, and as I watched them circle the cabin in their eternal dance, I began to understand that the footsteps I'd been hearing weren't echoes of sound at all. They were echoes of guilt. By morning, I'd made my decision. The trail to Sorrow's Peak was marked on my topographic map, a steep climb that would take most of the day, ending at the highest point in this section of the Appalachians. If J.M.'s diary was accurate, if the local folklore had any basis in reality, then speaking my confession backward from that summit might break whatever hold these mountains had taken on my mind. And if I was simply losing my sanity in the wilderness, then at least I'd exhaust myself enough to sleep through the night without hearing whispers in my own voice. The climb to Sorrow's Peak tested every muscle in my body and every ounce of determination I possessed. The trail was little more than a deer path in places, marked only by occasional blazes carved into the bark of ancient trees. The footsteps followed me every step of the way, maintaining their patient distance, never faltering even as the grade became so steep I had to use my hands to pull myself over rocky outcrops. As I climbed higher, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the rocks themselves now, seeping out of every crack and crevice like some kind of geological confession. I could hear my own voice speaking the words I'd released to the wind the day before, but they were fragmented and distorted, mixed with other voices speaking other secrets in languages I couldn't identify. The peak, when I finally reached it, was a bare granite dome that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding mountains. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of the silent fires. I stood at the highest point, pulled out the piece of paper where I'd written down my confession, and began the painstaking process of speaking it backward. Each syllable felt like swallowing glass. The words fought against me, as if they'd taken on a life of their own and refused to be undone. But I persisted, speaking the reversed confession into the gathering darkness, while the whispers grew to a crescendo around me. The sound built and built until it seemed like the entire mountain range was speaking in my voice. 10,000 echoes of my deepest shame creating a chorus that threatened to drive me mad. Then, suddenly, silence. The kind of absolute quiet that I'd thought I was seeking when I first entered these mountains. No whispers, no footsteps, no sense of being watched from the shadows. The relief was so intense that I fell to my knees on the granite dome, gasping for breath as if I'd been held underwater. But as I knelt there in the darkness, I began to realize that something was wrong with the silence. It wasn't natural. It was the absence of everything. No wind through the trees, no distant sounds of wildlife, no echo when I called out into the valley below. The mountains had gone completely dead, as if my backward confession had killed something essential in them. I made my way down the peak by moonlight, stumbling over rocks and roots in my haste to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the trail seemed different now, foreign. Trees I was certain I'd passed on the way up had vanished, replaced by unfamiliar landmarks that didn't match my memory or my map. When I finally reached what should have been my campsite, I found only empty forest. My tent was gone. My backpack, my supplies, my carefully planned route back to civilization, all of it had disappeared as if it had never existed. In their place was a small leather journal, identical to the one I'd found in the abandoned cabin. With trembling hands, I opened it to the first page and read my own handwriting. October 20th, 2024. The footsteps began again today, just as they did during my last visit here in 19. Always the same pattern, soft, deliberate, barefoot. When I turn to look, there's nothing, but I can feel eyes watching from the shadows between the trees. I know I should leave, but something keeps drawing me deeper into these mountains. I don't remember writing those words, but the handwriting was unmistakably mine. As I flipped through the pages, I found entries spanning years of visits to these mountains, describing the same experiences over and over again. The footsteps, the fires, the confession, the backward speaking on Sorrow's Peak. All of it repeated in an endless cycle that my conscious mind couldn't remember. The final entry, written in my own hand but in a style I didn't recognize, sent ice through my veins. The echo isn't something that follows you. The echo is something you become. Every time you speak your shame to the mountains, a piece of you stays behind. Every time you try to leave, you discover you're already part of what's keeping others here. The barefoot steps in the forest aren't made by spirits at all. They're made by people like me, like JM, like all the others who thought they could confess their way to freedom. We're the ones watching from the shadows now, waiting for the next soul to speak their secrets to the wind. The mountains don't trap you. You trap yourself over and over again, in an endless cycle of guilt and attempted redemption that never quite works. And the worst part is that each time you forget the previous visits until you find your own diary and remember what you've become. I'm writing this as a warning to myself, knowing I'll forget again by morning. The silence after the backward confession isn't peace. It's the sound of becoming something else entirely. Something that will spend eternity walking barefoot through these mountains, following other lost souls who think they can buy their freedom with whispered shame. I think I understand now why I keep coming back. It's not the echo that draws me. It's the hope that maybe this time, I'll remember who I used to be. As I read these words by moonlight, standing in a forest that no longer felt quite real, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching through the darkness behind me. Soft, deliberate, and completely silent against the forest floor. Barefoot steps that sounded exactly like my own. I closed the diary and began walking deeper into the mountains, following a trail that seemed to know exactly where I needed to go. Behind me, I could hear other footsteps joining mine, a chorus of the lost and forgotten, all of us walking the same eternal path through a wilderness that exists somewhere between confession and damnation. And in the distance, I could already hear the sound of someone new approaching on the main trail, their boots heavy with the weight of secrets they've never shared with another soul. I know I should warn them, but I can't remember how. The mountains are listening, and silence has become another kind of echo entirely. Story 10. The neon baptized everything in electric blood that night. Red, blue, purple veins pulsing through the Vegas darkness like some massive circulatory system designed by madmen. Marcus and I had stumbled into the Atomic Rose sometime after midnight, our third bar in what was supposed to be a celebration of his promotion. The place reeked of vintage cigarettes and broken dreams, all chrome fixtures and black leather that had seen better decades. I should have noticed the wrongness immediately. The way the bartender's eyes lingered too long on our faces, memorizing features. How the other patrons sat perfectly still, nursing drinks that never seemed to diminish. The silence that fell like a curtain whenever we spoke, as if our words were being catalogued by invisible stenographers. But I was drunk on success and cheap whiskey, and Marcus was gesticulating wildly about quarterly reports and corner offices, his voice cutting through the bar's oppressive quiet. That's when he saw it. The mirror. It dominated the back wall like some Art Deco monstrosity. Its silver surface fractured by hairline cracks that caught the light in ways that made my eyes water. The frame was ornate, carved with patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Vegas was full of tacky decorations, but this thing felt different. Ancient. Wrong. Marcus approached it with the confidence of a man who'd never learned to fear reflections. I watched him lean closer, studying the fractured surface, and that's when I saw it too. Through the spider web of cracks, another world bled through. Another strip, identical to the one outside yet fundamentally altered. The same casinos, the same neon arteries, but the streets were empty. Completely, impossibly empty. No tourists stumbling between casinos, no cars crawling through traffic, no street performers or hawkers or human activity of any kind. Just the lights, burning alone in the darkness like funeral pyres. The neon in that other place seemed brighter, more saturated, as if the absence of people allowed the colors to expand and breathe. They painted the empty streets in shades that didn't exist in our spectrum. Blues that cut deeper than sapphires, reds that pulsed with organic rhythm, greens that whispered of things that grew in places light never touched. Marcus pressed his palm against the glass, and I saw his reflection pause a heartbeat, too long before matching the movement. One heartbeat, two, three. The reflection smiled while Marcus's face remained neutral. Then the mirror swallowed him. No dramatic shattering, no special effects. One moment he was there, flesh and blood and cheap cologne, and the next the glass rippled like disturbed water. And he was gone. His reflection remained, staring back at me with eyes that held too much knowledge, mouth curved in an expression Marcus had never worn. I pressed my face to the glass, breath fogging the surface, and saw him on the other side. The real Marcus, not the reflection. He was standing in that empty neon wasteland, turning in slow circles, hands outstretched like a blind man navigating familiar furniture. His mouth moved in what looked like screaming, but no sound penetrated the barrier between worlds. The reflection. Marcus lifted one finger to its lips in a gesture of silence, then pointed behind me. I spun around. The bar was exactly as I'd left it. The same patrons in their frozen tableau, the bartender polishing a glass with mechanical precision. But now I could see what I'd missed before. None of them cast shadows. The light fell on them and died. as if they absorbed illumination instead of reflecting it. When I turned back to the mirror, the reflection was gone. Only Marcus remained, trapped in that neon purgatory, his terror visible in every gesture. I had to go after him. The compulsion wasn't logical. It bypassed reason entirely and lodged itself in the primitive part of my brain that still remembered when survival meant protecting the tribe. But as I raised my hand to touch the glass, I felt it. The weight of observation. Every person in the bar was watching me now, their heads turned at angles that should have been anatomically impossible. Faces blank as mannequins, but eyes alive with predatory intelligence. They were waiting for me to hesitate, waiting for my pulse to skip, for doubt to creep into my movements. The reflections fed on hesitation. I understood that now with the clarity that sometimes accompanies absolute terror. 3 heartbeats of uncertainty, and they could cross over, trade places, leave us stranded in their empty world while they walked among the living. I steadied my breathing, slowed my heart through sheer force of will, and placed my palm against the glass before fear could take root. The surface yielded like warm mercury, and I fell through into the other strip. The first thing that hit me was the cold. Vegas in July was a furnace, but this place carried winter in its bones. The neon provided no warmth, only light that seemed to leach heat from whatever it touched. My breath misted in the air, and I could feel the moisture freezing in my nostrils with each inhalation. The silence was profound. Not just the absence of human activity, but the complete negation of organic sound. No insects, no birds, no rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. But the lights, God, the lights were magnificent in their alien beauty. They pulsed with purposes I couldn't comprehend, following rhythms that had nothing to do with electricity or commerce. Patterns emerged in their flickering mathematical sequences that hurt to contemplate directly. I began to suspect they weren't advertisements at all, but some form of communication. Messages written in a language of pure light, transmitted between intelligences that had never known flesh. I walked the empty boulevards, calling Marcus's name into the void. My voice echoed strangely, bouncing back with subtly different intonations, as if the city was learning to mimic human speech. Casino doors hung open like hungry mouths, their interiors lost in shadows that defied the neon's illumination. I glimpsed movement in those depths, shapes that flowed rather than walked, presences that existed in the spaces between seconds. That's when I noticed the other pedestrians. They appeared gradually, like photographs developing in slow motion, translucent at first, gaining substance with each blink. People who looked almost right, tourists and locals and street performers who moved with the mechanical precision of wind-up toys. Their faces were perfect reproductions of humanity, but something in their eyes gave them away. They looked at the world with the hungry curiosity of things that had forgotten what it felt like to be alive. I recognized some of them. The businessmen from the hotel lobby, now walking in endless circles around a fountain that held no water. The cocktail waitress who'd served us earlier, her smile stretched beyond the limits of facial muscles. The security guard who'd nodded at us near the elevators, standing motionless beside a door that led nowhere. They were collecting people, I realized, building a catalog of human behavior, gesture by gesture, expression by expression. This empty city was their museum, and we were the exhibits. I found Marcus outside the Bellagio, staring up at the famous fountains. Here they danced to no music, water arcing through the air in patterns that followed no earthly choreography. The droplets caught the neon and fractured it into prismatic shards that painted rainbow shadows on the ground. He turned when I approached, and for a moment I thought I'd found another reflection. His face held that same too-perfect quality, that uncanny valley wrongness that made my skin crawl. But then I saw the fear in his eyes, real human terror that no reflection could counterfeit. We embraced without speaking, both of us understanding that words might be weapons here, might give the watchers new tools to perfect their mimicry. I pointed toward the sky, where the moon hung like a pale wound against the darkness. It was waning, 3/4 full, and I could see it moving with visible speed across the star-drunk heavens. When it changed quadrants, when it slipped from the southwestern sky to the western horizon, the boundary between worlds would solidify. We'd be trapped here forever, while our reflections lived our lives in the world of the living. Marcus nodded and we began to run. The city fought us. Streets rearranged themselves when we weren't looking, leading us in circles that should have been impossible. Sidewalks tilted and swayed like funhouse floors. The neon lights strobed faster, their patterns becoming more complex, more demanding of attention. I felt my thoughts beginning to fragment under their assault, my sense of direction dissolving into prismatic confusion. And always, the watchers followed. They moved with increasing boldness now, no longer content to observe from shadows. I caught glimpses of them in my peripheral vision, perfect human shapes that moved wrong, faces that were almost familiar, almost loved. They whispered to us in voices we recognized, promising comfort and rest, and an end to the terrible brightness that never dimmed. The moon continued its inexorable journey across the sky, half in the southwest now, sliding toward the western edge of the world. My watch had stopped working the moment I crossed through the mirror, but I could feel time draining away like sand through an hourglass. We found the atomic rose again, or it found us. The building stood exactly where it should, but wrong in every detail. The neon sign buzzed with insectile hunger, and through the windows I could see the bar's interior transformed into something from a fever dream. The same chrome and leather, but stretched and twisted into geometries that made my eyes ache. The mirror waited inside, its surface now showing our own world with perfect clarity. I could see the bar patrons sitting in their eternal poses, could smell the cigarettes and desperation seeping through the glass. It looked like paradise compared to this neon purgatory. But standing before the mirror were our reflections. They wore our faces with subtle improvements, features refined to inhuman perfection, eyes that held knowledge we'd never earned. They moved with fluid grace, free from the small imperfections that marked us as mortal. When they smiled, their teeth were too white, too straight, too numerous. My reflection stepped forward and pressed its palm against the glass from the other side. Its mouth moved in words I could hear despite the barrier between worlds. Why struggle? We can be you better than you ever were. No more doubts, no more fears, no more small failures that accumulate like scars. Let us take your places, and you can rest here in the light eternal. The offer was seductive. This city of pure light held a terrible beauty, and I could feel it working on my mind like a drug. What was so important about our flawed, mortal world anyway? What did we have there that was worth preserving? But then I looked at Marcus, the real Marcus, and saw my own humanity reflected in his eyes. The capacity for growth, for change, for the beautiful mistakes that made life worth living. Our reflections were perfect, but they were also static. They could mimic but not create, could copy but not dream. The moon touched the western horizon. I grabbed Marcus's hand and we dove for the mirror together, not at our reflections, but at the spaces between them. The glass shattered around us in a shower of silver fragments, each piece reflecting a different version of reality. For a moment we fell through multiple worlds simultaneously. I saw versions of myself that had made different choices, lived different lives, loved different people. Then we crashed back into the solid, imperfect world of flesh and consequence. The atomic rose was exactly as we'd left it, but the mirror was gone. In its place hung a simple black cloth, and behind that, a wall of ordinary brick. The bartender looked up from his eternal glass polishing with mild curiosity, as if we'd merely stepped outside for air. The other patrons resumed their conversations, their drinks mysteriously refreshed, their shadows restored to proper proportions. The wrongness I'd sensed earlier was gone, leaving only the familiar seediness of a Vegas dive bar. Marcus and I sat in silence for a long time, not trusting our voices, not trusting our memories. The events felt distant now, like a half-remembered dream that fades in daylight. When we finally spoke, it was of ordinary things: work, weather, the quality of the whiskey. But sometimes, when the light hits a surface just right, I catch glimpses of that other strip. The neon purgatory where our reflections learn to be us, where they practice our mannerisms and memorize our histories. They're patient, these mirror people. They understand that glass is everywhere in the modern world, that everyone eventually hesitates before their own reflection. 3 heartbeats. That's all it takes. I've stopped looking in mirrors when I can help it. When I can't avoid them, I move quickly, decisively, never allowing doubt to creep into my movements. But late at night, when sleep eludes me, and the city lights paint patterns on my ceiling, I wonder if I made it back at all. Sometimes my reflection seems to know things I don't remember learning. Sometimes it smiles when I'm not smiling, speaks when my mouth is closed. Sometimes I catch it practicing how to be me, and I realize the most terrifying truth of all. There's no way to be certain which side of the mirror I'm really on. Story 11. The house chose me, or so I told myself during those first weeks in the Denver suburb. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a mortgage that stretched my salary thin as wire. But it was the silence that sold me. The kind of suburban quiet I'd craved after years of city sirens and honking horns. I should have paid attention to how complete that silence was, how it seemed to press against my eardrums like cotton. My neighbor introduced himself the second day. Edgar Marsh stood at my fence line, 70-ish, with calloused hands and eyes that never quite met mine. He mumbled something about the observatory behind his house, how I shouldn't worry about the occasional noise. Through the chain link, I could see the makeshift structure, a dome of corrugated metal and salvaged wood that looked more like a bunker than a stargazing station. "Astronomy hobby?" I asked, trying to be neighborly. Edgar's laugh came out as a wheeze, something like that. Just don't mind the vibrations. I assumed he meant the telescope motor or cooling fans. Amateur astronomers were particular about their equipment. What struck me as odd was the direction the structure faced, not skyward, but angled toward the ground like some perverted mining operation. The first tremor came 3 nights later. I'd been lying in bed drifting toward sleep when the house shuddered. Not an earthquake. I'd felt those in California. This was different, more rhythmic, like a heartbeat deep underground. The bedroom window rattled in its frame, and somewhere in the walls, pipes groaned with a metallic voice I'd never heard before. I checked the news. No seismic activity reported. No construction scheduled in the area. I convinced myself it was settling. Old houses do that, I reasoned, even though the place had been built in 1987. The tremors continued nightly, always between midnight and 3 a.m., always with that peculiar rhythm. Sometimes faint enough to dismiss as imagination, other times strong enough to knock books from shelves. I started sleeping in the living room, away from the side of the house that faced Edgar's property. It was during the 4th night that I noticed the pattern. The vibrations came in sequences, 3 short pulses, then 2 long ones, then silence for exactly 17 seconds before starting again. I timed it obsessively, sitting cross-legged on my hardwood floor with a stopwatch app. The precision was unsettling. Natural phenomena didn't operate with such mechanical regularity. Through my kitchen window, I could see Edgar's observatory. A dull red light emanated from within, casting weird shadows across his backyard. The structure itself seemed to hum, though whether the sound came from machinery or the earth beneath it, I couldn't tell. By the 2nd week, the tremors were affecting more than my sleep. I'd reach for my coffee mug and grab empty air, my hand overshooting by inches. Street signs I'd read a dozen times suddenly appeared foreign, their letters swimming like alphabet soup. Twice I found myself standing in my driveway at dawn with no memory of how I'd gotten there, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The disorientation felt physical, as if someone was periodically adjusting the dials on reality. Colors seemed more saturated some days, washed out others. Sounds arrived delayed, like old movies where the audio doesn't match the video. I started keeping a journal, desperate to track which experiences belonged to which day. Tuesday. Tremors lasted 47 minutes. Found myself in kitchen making sandwich I don't remember wanting. Bread was stale but tasted like copper. Wednesday. No vibrations until 2:47 a.m. Woke up with dirt under fingernails. Haven't done any gardening. Thursday. Called in sick. Spent day watching Edgar's dome. Red light pulses in sync with ground movement. That last entry worried me most. I was a software engineer, methodical by nature. Paranoid fantasies weren't my style. Yet here I was, documenting evidence of something I couldn't explain, something that made me question my own perceptions. I decided to confront Edgar directly. His front yard was immaculate, too perfect, like a model home display. No weeds, no fallen leaves, grass cut to uniform height. Even the mailbox gleamed as if polished daily. The obsessive maintenance felt aggressive somehow, a declaration that chaos would not be tolerated. Edgar answered his door before I knocked, as if he'd been watching my approach. Up close, his skin had a waxy quality, and his eyes held the focused intensity of someone working on a complex mathematical problem. "The vibrations," I began. "They're coming from your place." He nodded slowly, as if appreciating my directness. "You feel them too. Good." I wasn't sure. "What do you mean, too?" "Come see for yourself." He gestured toward his backyard. "Might as well understand what you're dealing with." The observatory interior defied my expectations. No typical telescope pointed skyward. Instead, the main instrument was massive, brass and black metal, angled downward through a hole cut in the concrete floor. Monitors lined the walls, displaying what looked like seismic readings and star charts, though the constellations seemed wrong somehow, too dense, with patterns I didn't recognize. "Most people look up," Edgar said, adjusting dials on a control panel. "Waste of time. Everything interesting already fell." The main display showed a three-dimensional map of the underground area. Dozens of bright dots clustered beneath our neighborhood, pulsing like Christmas lights. Each pulse corresponded to a tremor I'd felt. "Meteorites?" I asked, though the word felt inadequate. "Bigger than that. Much bigger." Edgar's voice carried a strange pride. "They've been down there for millennia, waiting. Most stay dormant, but every few decades one tries to wake up. When they move, they influence everything around them. Gravity, magnetic fields, time itself." I stared at the screen, watching the lights pulse in synchronized patterns. Part of me wanted to run, to dismiss this as the ramblings of an eccentric old man. But the evidence was right there, matching perfectly with my experiences of the past 2 weeks. What happens if one wakes up completely? Edgar's expression darkened. Ground splits open, the thing rises, and everyone within a 5-mile radius changes. Changes how? Lost time, scrambled memories. Some people forget their own names. Others remember things that never happened. He pointed to a particularly bright dot on the screen. "That one's been getting restless lately, right under your house." The room seemed to tilt slightly, though whether from vertigo or another tremor, I couldn't tell. "How long do we have?" "Alignment happens tomorrow night. If I can't redirect the resonance frequency by then..." He trailed off, fingers dancing across the control panel. "There's a dead star in the Lyra constellation. Collapsed, inert. If I can lock the buried star's attention on that instead of trying to surface, it should go dormant again." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but my scrambled memories and sleepless nights argued against skepticism. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing. Go home. Try to stay indoors tomorrow after sunset. And whatever you do, don't look directly at the ground if it starts glowing." Walking back across our adjoining yards, I noticed details I'd missed before. The grass between our properties grew in strange patterns, forming spirals that hurt to look at directly. Concrete sidewalks showed hairline cracks that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Even the air felt thicker, charged with potential energy. That night, I couldn't eat. Food tasted like metal and ash. I tried reading, watching television, anything to distract myself from the knowledge that something vast and alien squirmed beneath my foundation. Every small noise made me jump. The refrigerator humming, pipes clicking as they cooled, floorboards settling. Around 10 p.m., I noticed the quality of light changing outside. Not darker, but different somehow, as if filtered through water or thick glass. The streetlights cast multiple shadows, each slightly offset from the others. When I blinked, the shadows moved independently. Midnight brought the strongest tremor yet. My entire house lurched sideways, picture frames crashing to the floor. Through the walls came a sound like whale song played through broken speakers, deep, mournful, and definitely not mechanical. The hardwood beneath my feet grew warm, then hot enough that I had to lift my bare soles and dance from foot to foot. Red light blazed from Edgar's observatory, strobing in complex patterns. I could see his silhouette moving frantically between instruments, adjusting controls, shouting words I couldn't quite hear over the subsonic groaning from below. The temperature in my house began dropping rapidly. My breath misted, and ice crystals formed on the windows despite the autumn warmth outside. Whatever was happening down there was affecting basic physics in ways that made my engineering background scream in protest. Then came the voices. Not from outside, but from the basement, the walls, the very air around me. Whispered conversations in languages I'd never heard, sometimes overlapping until they became a chorus of incomprehensible sound. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voices seemed to originate inside my skull. "It's happening," one voice said clearly, in English. "The star remembers the surface." I ran outside, desperate to escape the claustrophobic weight of those whispers. The suburban street looked normal except for the shadows, which now moved independently of their sources. My neighbor's house across the street cast a shadow toward the east, while the streetlight clearly shone from the west. Edgar's red light continued strobing, and now I could see thin beams penetrating the ground at sharp angles. The earth around his property had begun to glow faintly, like coals in a dying fire. Where the light touched my yard, the grass withered instantly. A new tremor knocked me to my knees. This one felt different, purposeful, as if something massive was testing its strength against the soil and stone that imprisoned it. Cracks appeared in my driveway, glowing with the same red luminescence. The asphalt felt soft under my palms, like warm clay. I understood then that Edgar was losing his battle. Whatever dead star he was trying to contact either couldn't hear him or couldn't help. The buried thing was going to surface, and when it did, the changes he'd mentioned would begin in earnest. Already I could feel my thoughts becoming fuzzy around the edges, memories from childhood mixed with events that hadn't happened yet. I remembered my first day at this house. Except in the memory, Edgar was younger, and the observatory pointed skyward like it should. I remembered conversations with my wife, though I'd been single for 3 years. The red glow beneath my yard intensified, and hairline fractures spread across the concrete like a spider web. Something was definitely moving down there, pressing upward with incredible force. I imagined tentacles or wings or geometries that human eyes weren't designed to process. Edgar's strobing light suddenly changed pattern, becoming steadier, more focused. Through his open observatory door, I heard him shouting coordinates into his radio. Whether to the dead star or to someone else entirely, I couldn't tell. But the pressure in the air began to lessen slightly. The buried star's upward push slowed, then stopped. The red glow faded to a sullen ember. Around me, the shadow patterns returned to normal, and the whispered voices grew quiet. Whatever Edgar had done, it seemed to be working. But as I stood in my driveway, watching the cracks in the asphalt slowly seal themselves, I realized the most disturbing truth of all. I couldn't be certain any of this had actually happened. My journal entries from the past 2 weeks were gone, though I clearly remembered writing them. The tremors I'd documented so carefully might have been nothing more than settling pipes in my own restless sleeping. Edgar's observatory, when I looked at it now in the dim streetlight, appeared to be nothing more than a garden shed. Had I imagined the entire experience? Was I suffering some kind of breakdown, projecting elaborate fantasies onto a perfectly normal suburban relocation? The possibility terrified me more than buried stars or reality-warping entities. I went back inside and tried to sleep. But lying in my bed, I could swear I still felt a faint vibration in the floorboards. Not the rhythmic tremors of before, but something subtler. A pulse. A heartbeat. Something vast and patient, waiting just beneath the surface of my carefully ordered world. In the morning, I would call a realtor. But deep down, I suspected it wouldn't matter where I moved. Some things, once awakened, never fully go back to sleep. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that might exist only in the spaces between our certainties, in the gaps where sanity frays and reality becomes negotiable. The suburban silence I'd craved so desperately had returned, but now it felt different, not peaceful, but expectant, as if the quiet itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would emerge next from the buried darkness below. Story 12. The thumb had been extended for 27 minutes when the sedan materialized from the heat shimmer. In New Mexico's high desert, vehicles appeared like mirages, wavering phantoms that might dissolve before reaching you. But this one maintained its trajectory, growing larger against the endless ribbon of asphalt that stretched toward mountains reduced to purple smudges by distance and atmospheric haze. My water bottle held maybe 3 swallows left. The rental car had died 40 miles back, its engine seizing with a metallic shriek that echoed across the scrubland like something wounded. Cell service had vanished somewhere near Gallup, and the roadside assistance number might as well have been a prayer to absent gods. The sedan slowed, gravel crunching under tires as it pulled onto the shoulder. Through the windshield, I glimpsed the driver, middle-aged, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. The passenger door swung open with a faint creak. "Where you headed?" The voice carried a regional accent, flat vowels that belonged to these endless spaces. "Anywhere with a phone," I replied, climbing into the blessed coolness of air conditioning. The interior smelled of coffee and something else, something metallic that made my sinuses itch. He nodded toward the highway. "Next town's about 30 miles. The driver appeared unremarkable in that deliberately forgettable way some people cultivate. His hands gripped the steering wheel with calloused precision, wedding ring catching occasional flashes of sunlight. Baseball cap shadowed most of his face, but I caught glimpses of weathered skin and dark stubble. He could have been anyone, a local rancher, traveling salesman, weekend fisherman heading home. We merged back onto the highway, the speedometer settling at 65. Heat created rippling distortions above the asphalt, making distant objects dance like underwater reflections. Sagebrush dotted the landscape in irregular patterns, each plant casting its own sharp shadow in the afternoon sun. The radio played something low and crackling, classic country that faded in and out with atmospheric interference. Occasionally, the driver would adjust the dial, hunting for clearer signals that never materialized. Static filled the spaces between songs like electronic sand. "Car breakdown?" he asked after several miles of silence. "Engine seized, probably shot." He made a sympathetic noise in his throat. "These rental companies, they don't maintain them worth a damn." His accent carried traces of Texas mixed with something more local, the kind of speech pattern that developed over generations in isolated places, words shaped by wind and distance. I found myself listening more to the rhythm than the content, letting conversation drift into background noise. Mile marker 43 flashed past, followed by 44. The numbers counted down toward some unknown destination, each one marking distance traveled and distance remaining. In this vast emptiness, they served as the only reference points, metallic monuments to human measurement imposed on landscape that recognized no boundaries. The first reflective sign appeared at mile 45. Warning, construction zone ahead. The diamond-shaped marker caught sunlight and threw it back with mirror-bright intensity. For a fraction of a second as we passed, I glimpsed something in the reflection. Not just our car, but something else. Something wrong. 2 faces in the front seat. I blinked, turning to look directly at the driver. One man, hands on wheel, baseball cap casting shadows across his features. Exactly what I expected to see. But in that brief moment when sunlight had bounced off reflective metal, I could have sworn. "You see that sign?" I asked. "Which one?" "The construction warning." He shrugged. "Always construction somewhere." Mile marker 46 passed, then 47. The landscape remained unchanged. Endless scrub punctuated by distant mesas that looked like ancient fortifications. Heat created its own weather system, generating dust devils that spiraled across the desert floor before dissipating into nothing. Another reflective sign materialized ahead. "Merge left." Same diamond shape, same mirror-bright surface designed to catch headlights and warn drivers. As we approached, I found myself watching it intently, waiting for that moment when angle and sunlight would align. There, in the reflection, two distinct profiles in the front seat. This time I was certain. The driver's silhouette, baseball cap and all, occupied the left side of the reflected image. But beside him, overlapping slightly, another shape. Different hat, different jawline, different everything. My stomach performed a slow, queasy rotation. I studied the actual driver, looking for some explanation. Perhaps he wore glasses that created an optical illusion. Maybe the reflection distorted his features in some predictable way. But his face remained singular, unremarkable, exactly what it should be. "Hot day," he commented, adjusting the air conditioning. "Yeah." My voice sounded strained, so I cleared my throat and tried again. "Yeah, brutal." The speedometer held steady at 65. Mile markers continued their countdown, 48, 49, 50. Each number brought us closer to whatever destination he had in mind, though he hadn't specified where exactly he was going. I realized I'd been so grateful for the ride that I hadn't asked basic questions about our route or timeline. "So, where are you headed?" I asked. "I mean, ultimately." "Down the road a piece." His answer carried no information, delivered in the same flat tone he'd used for everything else. Not evasive exactly, but not forthcoming either. The kind of response that ended conversations rather than extending them. Another reflective sign approached. Speed limit 65. Same bright surface. Same moment of mirror-like clarity as we passed. Same impossible reflection showing two occupants in the front seat where only one should exist. The second figure appeared more distinct this time. Different clothing, different posture, as if someone else occupied the same space as the driver but slightly out of phase. Like a double-exposure photograph where two images blended imperfectly. I felt sweat beating on my forehead despite the air conditioning. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Heat distortion, optical illusions, stress from the breakdown creating hallucinations. People saw mirages in deserts all the time. Dehydration could cause all sorts of perceptual problems. But the reflection appeared too consistent, too specific. Each time, the same two figures. Each time, the same impossible overlay of separate existences sharing singular space. "You doing okay?" the driver asked. "You look a little pale." "Just thinking about the car, wondering what went wrong." Mechanical failures happen, usually when you least expect them. His words carried undertones I couldn't quite identify. Not menace exactly, but something that made the hair on my neck prickle. Or maybe paranoia was setting in. Isolation and heat creating suspicions where none belonged. Mile 51, 52, 53. The numbers felt increasingly significant, as if counting down towards some predetermined event. But that was ridiculous. Mile markers were just mile markers, arbitrary measurements that meant nothing beyond distance traveled. The radio crackled and shifted, catching fragments of different stations. A weather report mentioned temperatures reaching triple digits across the region. A news update discussed drought conditions affecting local agriculture. Then static swallowed everything, leaving only electronic whispers that might have been voices, or might have been atmospheric interference. "Radio reception's terrible out here," I said. "Distance from the transmitters. Mountains block signals." He spoke without taking his eyes off the road, hands maintaining their steady grip on the steering wheel. Wedding ring caught light from the side window, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the dashboard. Everything about him remained perfectly normal, perfectly explainable, except for the reflections. Another sign approached, curves ahead, diamond-shaped, mirror-bright, positioned to catch light and return it. As we drew near, I held my breath, watching for that moment of reflected clarity. Two faces, always two faces. This time I could see more detail. The second figure wore a different style of hat, wider brim, different color. His jaw was sharper, cheekbones more pronounced. Not similar enough to be the same person seen from different angles, but distinct enough to be recognizably different. "How long have you been driving this route?" I asked. "Long time. Ever pick up other hitchhikers?" Something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptible tightening of shoulders. "Occasionally, people get stranded out here." "What happens to them?" "Same thing that'll happen to you. They get where they're going." His answer carried that same neutral tone, but now it felt loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. Or maybe I was reading too much into ordinary words, letting imagination transform innocent statements into sinister implications. Mile 54 passed, then 55. The countdown continued toward some unknown significance. 66 had become fixed in my mind as a crucial number, though I couldn't remember why. Something about it felt important, urgent, like a deadline approaching too quickly. The next reflective sign read, "Next services, 11 miles." Another diamond shape, another moment of impossible reflection. But this time when I looked, I saw three faces in the front seat. The driver, plus the second figure I'd been seeing, plus a third profile overlapping both. Different hat again, different features, as if multiple people occupied the same space in layered simultaneity. Not quite transparent, not quite solid, existing in some intermediate state between presence and absence. My hands started shaking. I gripped the door handle to steady them, feeling metal warm from sunlight streaming through the window. The rational explanations were crumbling under the weight of consistent impossibility. Heat distortion didn't create multiple distinct faces. Dehydration didn't generate such specific hallucinations. "Stop the car," I said. "Something wrong?" "I need to get out. We're in the middle of nowhere, no services for miles." "I don't care. Stop the car." He maintained steady speed, making no move toward the brake pedal. "You sure about that? Pretty hot out there for walking." Mile 56 flashed past. 10 miles to 66. The number felt increasingly significant, though I still couldn't remember why it mattered. Some half-recalled warning that my conscious mind had forgotten, but my instincts remembered. I said, "Stop the car. Almost to the next town. You'll be more comfortable waiting there." His voice remained maddeningly calm, as if my growing agitation was merely weather to be endured. But his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles showing white beneath sun-darkened skin. Another reflective sign, steep grade ahead. As we passed, I saw 4 faces in the reflection. The driver, plus 3 others layered behind him like photographic exposures burned into the same frame. Different hats, different profiles, different everything except the space they occupied. Understanding hit with nauseating clarity. The car wasn't just transportation, it was collection. Each passenger who entered left something behind, some essential part of themselves that remained trapped while their bodies continued the journey. The reflections weren't optical illusions, but evidence of accumulated presence, consciousness captured and preserved in the vehicle's surfaces. "Let me out," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Can't do that. Not safe to stop on the highway." Mile 57, 58, 59. The speedometer held at 65 with mechanical precision. No variation, no adjustment for curves or grades, as if the car had been set to autopilot, following some predetermined course towards some predetermined destination. I tried the door handle, locked. Tried the window controls. Nothing. The mechanisms moved but produced no result, like operating disconnected switches that controlled nothing. Why won't they work? Safety feature. Can't have passengers falling out at highway speeds. But we both knew it wasn't about safety. The car had become something else. Not quite prison, not quite tomb, but a transitional space where the usual rules didn't apply, where bodies could continue their journey while consciousness remained behind, trapped in reflective surfaces like insects in amber. Mile 60, 61, 62. Each number brought us closer to the threshold I now remembered with crystalline clarity. Mile 66, the point of no return. After that, my body would complete the journey while my awareness joined the collection of reflected faces, adding one more layer to the accumulating presence. "You can't do this," I said. "Can't do what?" "Keep me here. Trap me." He glanced over for the first time since I'd gotten in the car. In direct sunlight, his face looked different. Older, more weathered, with lines that spoke of decades spent on these roads. But his eyes held depths that seemed familiar, as if I'd seen them before in other faces. "Nobody's trapped," he said. "You got in voluntarily. You'll get out when the time comes." "When is that?" "When we reach your destination." Mile 63. 64. The desert landscape began changing subtly. Fewer plants, more exposed rock, as if we were entering a zone where life had withdrawn. The mountains ahead looked closer, but no more welcoming. Purple masses that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Another sign. Last exit before county line. The reflection showed 5 faces now, layered so densely that individual features began blurring together. A palimpsest of consciousness, each layer partially obscuring those beneath while remaining partially visible itself. "How many?" I asked. "How many what?" "How many people have you collected?" "I don't collect anything, I just drive." Mile 65. 1 more to go. The speedometer maintained its steady 65, eating distance with mechanical inevitability. No amount of pleading or reasoning would change the car's trajectory toward whatever waited at mile 66. I could feel something loosening inside me. Not physically, but some deeper connection that held consciousness to flesh. Like a rope fraying one strand at a time, preparing to snap under increasing tension. Each rotation of the wheels weakened the bond between awareness and body. The last reflective sign before mile 66 read, "End construction zone." As we passed, I saw my own face beginning to appear in the layered reflection. Faint at first, like a developing photograph, but growing more distinct as we approached the crucial mile marker. "Stop fighting it," the driver said. "Makes the transition easier." His voice sounded different now, not just his accent but the tone itself, as if multiple people were speaking through the same mouth, words shaped by overlapping intentions. I realized he might not be entirely himself anymore either, but some composite entity formed from collected consciousness. Mile marker 66 appeared ahead. The car began slowing as we approached, speedometer dropping from 65 to 60 to 55, not because the driver was stopping, but because velocity became irrelevant at the threshold. Physical laws operated differently here, where space and time bent around accumulated presence. As we passed the marker, I felt the final strand snap. My body remained in the passenger seat, but I found myself viewing it from outside. Not floating above like the classic near-death experience, but displaced sideways into some adjacent dimension where reflections lived. The windshield had become a window between states of being, showing the car's interior from the perspective of captured consciousness. The driver turned to my body and spoke words I could no longer hear. My body nodded and responded, but I couldn't access those words or thoughts. It had become a separate entity operating on residual programming, while my awareness joined the collection of reflected faces. Through the windshield, I could see the desert continuing beyond mile 66. More road, more markers, more opportunities to collect travelers who accepted rides from helpful strangers. My body would complete the journey to wherever the car was going, emerging at some distant destination with no memory of the transition or loss. But I would remain here, in the space between reflection and reality, watching future passengers repeat the same journey toward the same inevitable threshold, adding my awareness to the growing accumulation of consciousness that had learned too late what price the car extracted for its assistance. The speedometer climbed back to 65 as we left mile 66 behind. In the reflection of the next sign, "Welcome to Lincoln County," I counted 6 faces now, my own the newest addition to the collection. But already I could feel my individual identity beginning to blur at the edges, merging gradually with the composite entity that had once been separate passengers. Soon, when the car stopped for its next hitchhiker, I would be part of the driver who offered assistance with such practiced normalcy, part of the voice that provided reassuring answers to nervous questions, part of the presence that maintained steady speed toward mile 66, where another consciousness would join our growing collection. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, filled with opportunities for assistance and accumulation. And somewhere in the layered awareness that now included my own, I understood with perfect clarity that this had always been my destination. I had simply taken longer than most to arrive. Story 13. The leather seat beneath me creaked with the rhythm of steel wheels against track, a hypnotic percussion that seemed to echo the frantic beating of my heart. Outside the window, darkness swallowed the landscape whole, broken only by occasional flickers of distant farmhouse lights that appeared and vanished like dying stars. The night train to St. Louis carried me away from everything I'd ever known, away from the suffocating walls of my childhood home, and the voice of my father still ringing in my ears, telling me I'd never amount to anything. At 17, I thought I knew what freedom felt like. I was wrong. The passenger car stretched before me in amber twilight, courtesy of dim overhead bulbs that cast more shadows than light. Most seats remained empty at this ungodly hour, 3 in the morning, according to the conductor's earlier announcement. The few other passengers had long since succumbed to sleep, their forms hunched and motionless like prayer statues in a forgotten chapel. That's when he appeared. I hadn't noticed him board. One moment the seat across from me was vacant, and the next, an elderly gentleman sat there as if he'd materialized from the train's very essence. He wore a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the weak light around him, and his face bore the deep lines of someone who had lived through decades of secrets. Most striking, however, was the deck of cards he held. Not playing cards, but what appeared to be old photographs or postcards, their edges yellowed with age and handling. The man's eyes, pale as winter fog, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When he smiled, I noticed his teeth were too white, too perfect for someone his age. "Long journey ahead," he said, his voice carrying a strange accent I couldn't place. "Care for some company?" I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant despite the inexplicable unease settling in my stomach. The man shuffled his cards with practiced ease, the soft whisper of paper against paper barely audible over the train's mechanical lullaby. "I have a proposition," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "A game, if you will. For each stop we pass, you tell me a story, any story from your life, and I'll show you one of these cards. What do you say?" The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but the exhaustion of the past few weeks, the emotional drain of leaving everything behind, had left me vulnerable to distraction. Besides, what harm could there be in talking to a lonely old man on a night train? "Sure," I heard myself say. "Why not?" The first story came easily. I told him about my 8th birthday party, when my mother had surprised me with a chocolate cake shaped like a baseball glove. I described the taste of vanilla frosting, the way the afternoon sunlight streamed through our kitchen window, and how she'd laughed when I got chocolate all over my face. As I spoke, I felt an odd sensation, like something precious was being gently extracted from behind my ribcage. When I finished, the man nodded approvingly and turned over his first card. The image showed a train station I didn't recognize, its platform empty except for a lone figure standing in the mist. But something about the figure's posture seemed familiar, though I couldn't place why. The train whistle blew. Our first stop. A few passengers shuffled on and off. their movements sluggish and dreamlike in the pre-dawn gloom. "Magnificent," the man whispered, and I could swear I saw something shifting beneath the fabric of his left sleeve, like ink spreading under skin. The second story was about my first day of high school. I recounted the nervous energy that had buzzed through my veins, the smell of fresh textbooks and floor wax, the way my voice had cracked when the teacher called my name. Again, that strange sensation of loss, as if the memory was being slowly drained from some deep well within me. The man's second card depicted a school hallway, empty lockers stretching into shadow. The fluorescent lighting in the image flickered with an unnatural rhythm that made my eyes water. By the third stop, I began to notice something deeply wrong. When I tried to recall the birthday party I'd just shared, the details felt fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. The chocolate cake became vanilla, then strawberry, then disappeared entirely. My mother's laughter faded to silence, and suddenly I couldn't remember if she'd even been there at all. The man across from me had rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms covered in what appeared to be fresh tattoos, intricate script in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow the words felt familiar, like echoes of my own voice. "Something wrong?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I wanted to say yes, wanted to scream that something was terribly wrong, but the words stuck in my throat like dry leaves. Instead, I found myself telling him about my first pet, a golden retriever named Charlie who used to sleep at the foot of my bed. The memory flowed out of me like water through a broken dam, taking with it the warmth and comfort I'd carried for years. The man's third card showed a dog collar hanging from a fence post, its metal tags catching moonlight like tiny mirrors. Stop after stop, story after story, I felt pieces of myself disappearing. The graduation speech I'd been proud of became a blank space in my mind. My first kiss dissolved into uncertainty. Had it happened in the park or the school parking lot? Had it happened at all? The man's arms were now completely covered in shifting, moving text that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Panic crept through my nervous system like ice water. I tried to remember my own name and felt a moment of pure terror when it took several seconds to surface. Even then, it felt foreign on my tongue, like a word I'd heard but never spoken. "Please," I managed to whisper as the train approached what I hoped was the second-to-last stop. "I need to stop." The man's smile widened, revealing those unnaturally perfect teeth. "But we're having such a delightful conversation. Besides, we have time for one more story. The best one always comes last." I looked around the passenger car desperately, seeking help from the other travelers, but they remained motionless as corpses. The dim lighting seemed to flicker in rhythm with the tattoos on the man's arms, and I realized with growing horror that some of the script was in English now. Fragments of the stories I'd told, my own words inscribed in his flesh. The train began to slow, and through the intercom came the conductor's voice. "Next stop, St. Louis Union Station. Please gather your belongings." "No," I said, struggling to my feet on unsteady legs. "Not yet. I need to find the conductor." The man's eyes followed me as I stumbled toward the front of the car, his card still clutched in hands that seemed too long for his arms. "Running won't help," he called after me. "We had an agreement." The narrow aisle seemed to stretch before me like a tunnel, each step requiring enormous effort. The other passengers remained frozen in their seats, and as I passed them, I noticed they cast no shadows in the amber light. Their breathing was too shallow, their stillness too complete. I found the conductor's compartment at the front of the car, my hands shaking as I knocked on the door. When it opened, I came face to face with a man whose eyes were completely white, not clouded with cataracts, but simply absent of iris and pupil altogether. "Conductor," I gasped, "you have to stop the train. There's a man back there who's stealing my memories." The blind conductor tilted his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow echo of wind through empty spaces. "I hear them," he said quietly. "Your lost memories. They sing to me from his flesh, crying out like birds trapped in cages. But the contract was made freely, wasn't it? You chose to play his game." "I didn't know what I was agreeing to," I pleaded. Please just stop the train one station early. Let me off before he takes the last one. The conductor's sightless gaze seemed to pierce through me. And what memory would that be? The one that defines who you are? I opened my mouth to answer and felt my blood turn to slush. I couldn't remember what my final story would be. In fact, as I stood there in the swaying train car, I couldn't remember much of anything. My childhood home was a blur of rooms without detail. My parents' faces wavered like reflections on disturbed water. Even my own reflection in the conductor's window seemed translucent, as if I was slowly fading from existence entirely. He takes the stories that make us human, the conductor continued, his white eyes unblinking. But he cannot take what we never had the chance to tell. The future exists only in potential, not in memory. Through the train's windows, I could see the lights of St. Louis growing brighter, the urban glow pushing back the darkness that had surrounded us for hours. The city's presence felt like salvation, but I knew we were running out of time. "How do I stop him?" I whispered. "You don't stop him," the conductor replied. "You change the rules of his game." When I returned to my seat, the man was waiting with his final card already in hand. His entire body was now covered in the flowing script of my stolen stories, the words moving across his skin like living things. He looked more real than before, more solid, while I felt increasingly insubstantial. "Ready for the last story?" he asked, his voice now carrying echoes of my own inflection. I sat down slowly, my mind racing through the conductor's cryptic words. Change the rules. Don't tell a memory. Tell a possibility. "Yes," I said, looking directly into those pale, hungry eyes. "I'll tell you about the man I'm going to become." For the first time since our conversation began, the man's confidence wavered. "I don't understand." "I'm going to tell you about my future," I continued, feeling strength returning to my voice. "About the stories I haven't lived yet, the memories I haven't made, about the job I'll get in St. Louis, the apartment I'll find, the friends I'll meet, about the woman I'll fall in love with and the children we'll have together, about growing old and watching sunsets from a porch I haven't built yet." The man's face contorted with confusion and something that might have been fear. "That's not how the game works. You can't tell me stories that haven't happened." "Why not?" I asked, standing up as the train's brakes began to engage. "You never said they had to be true. You just said stories from my life, and these will be from my life. Just not the part that's already passed." As I spoke, I watched the tattoos on the man's arms begin to fade and flicker. The script that had been so vibrant and alive moments before now seemed uncertain, struggling to maintain its grip on reality. The stories I wove about my imagined future grew more elaborate and detailed, and with each word, I felt my stolen memories beginning to return. The chocolate birthday cake reappeared in my mind, complete with my mother's laughter. Charlie, the golden retriever, bounded back into existence, his tail wagging with remembered joy. The first day of school nervousness returned as a familiar flutter in my stomach. The train shuddered to a complete stop, and through the windows, I could see the grand architecture of Union Station bathed in the gentle light of dawn. The man across from me was now barely visible, his form wavering like heat shimmer on summer pavement. "This isn't over," he whispered, his voice growing distant. "There are other trains, other travelers." But I was already moving toward the exit, my recovered memories solid and warm in my mind. The other passengers were stirring now, blinking in confusion as if waking from a shared dream. Their shadows had returned, and their breathing carried the natural rhythm of the living. As I stepped onto the platform, I turned back to look at the train car I'd just exited. Through the window I could see an empty seat where the man had been, with only a single card lying on the worn fabric. Even from a distance I could make out the image. A young man standing on a train platform, looking back at something that was no longer there. The train pulled away with a long, mournful whistle, carrying its mysterious passenger toward whatever destination awaited him. I stood there for a long time, watching the red taillights disappear into the distance, wondering if I had really escaped, or if the entire experience had been some sort of exhaustion-induced hallucination. But as I walked through the grand halls of Union Station, I could swear I heard the faint sound of the conductor's voice carried on the morning breeze, speaking words that might have been a warning or a blessing. The future belongs to those brave enough to imagine it. I never found out which one it was. Years later, whenever I smell the particular mixture of diesel fuel and old leather that permeates train stations, I remember that night journey to St. Louis. I remember the man with his deck of impossible cards and the conductor with his sightless eyes. Most of all, I remember learning that sometimes the only way to keep your past is to have faith in your future. But late at night, when sleep eludes me and shadows gather in the corners of my vision, I still wonder about the stories I told him about my life to come. As each day passes and those imagined futures become my actual past, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, they too are being collected by pale hands and inscribed in flesh that hungers for what makes us human. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself checking my arms for unfamiliar markings, words that might be appearing in a script I cannot read, telling stories of a life I'm still learning how to live.